Imagine a village at the edge of the known world, a small clutch of wooden houses and frozen fields pressed against a wilderness so vast and so dark that no living soul among them could say where it ended, and in the winter of 1691, as the year turned slowly and painfully towards 1692, that wilderness seemed closer than ever, seemed to breathe against the window panes at night, seemed to whisper through the gaps in the walls where the wind crept in carrying the scent of pine and ice and something else. Something the people of Salem village could not name but could always feel. A presence, a weight, the sense that they were not alone in the dark, that something ancient and malevolent lived among those endless trees and watched them with patient, unblinking eyes. Salem village, Massachusetts, was not a town in any way you might picture a town today. It was a scattering of perhaps 600 souls spread across farms and homesteads, connected by narrow dirt roads that in winter became rivers of frozen mud, impassable for days at a time when the snow fell heavy and the temperature dropped so low that water left in a bucket by the hearth would freeze before morning. The nearest settlement of any real size was Salem town, several miles to the east, closer to the coast, wealthier, busier, a place of merchants and ships and commerce that the farmers of Salem village regarded with a complicated mixture of envy and resentment and moral suspicion. But even Salem town was a small place by any modern measure, and beyond it there was only the sea in one direction and the forest in every other, miles upon miles of ancient woodland stretching north and west into territories where English law meant nothing, and where, the villagers believed with absolute and unshakable certainty, the devil himself made his home. Try to feel what it was like to live in that world. Try to let your modern mind, so full of electric light and instant communication, and the comfortable knowledge that the universe operates by predictable physical laws, try to let all of that fall away and sink into the consciousness of a person living in Salem village in the winter of 1691. The sun set at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, sometimes earlier, and when it went down the darkness was total and absolute, a darkness that modern people almost never experience, a darkness so complete that you could hold your hand in front of your face and see nothing at all. The only light came from candles and hearth fires, and candles were expensive and had to be rationed. So much of the evening was spent in near darkness, huddled close to the fire, listening to the sounds of the house settling and the wind moving through the trees outside and trying not to think about what might be moving with it. There was no entertainment as we understand the word. There was no music because music was a sin, a frivolity that distracted the soul from its sole purpose, which was the glorification of God. There was no dancing, because dancing was the devil's invitation, a corruption of the body that opened the door to corruption of the spirit. There were no novels, no plays, no games of cards, no idle conversation that strayed too far from Scripture. Life was prayer and work and sleep, and even sleep was suspect, because in sleep the mind wandered into territory that the waking will could not control, and who knew what dark influences might find their way into an unguarded dream. The children of Salem village grew up in this world of relentless spiritual vigilance, taught from their earliest days that they were born into sin, that their natural impulses were corrupt, that the world around them was a battlefield between God and Satan, and that every thought, every feeling, every moment of pleasure or curiosity or wonder might be a trap set by the enemy of all mankind. They were taught to read so that they could read the Bible, and the Bible they read was full of witches and demons and divine wrath, full of stories about God's chosen people being tested and punished and delivered, and they understood these stories not as ancient history, but as a living description of their own reality. The devil was not a metaphor to these people. The devil was not a symbol or an abstraction, or a theological concept to be debated in comfortable university halls. The devil was a physical being who walked the earth in a physical body, who could appear as a man or an animal or a shadow in the corner of a room, who could speak in a human voice and make promises and strike bargains and corrupt the souls of the weak and the willing. Witchcraft was not superstition. Witchcraft was theology. It was as real and as documented and as certain as gravity is to you and me. The most educated ministers in New England, men who had studied at Harvard College, men who read Latin and Greek and Hebrew, men who were considered the intellectual elite of their society. These men wrote detailed treatises on the mechanics of witchcraft, on how the devil recruited his agents, on how witches could send their spectral shapes out to torment the innocent, on how the invisible world pressed constantly against the visible one like water against a dam, always seeking cracks, always threatening to break through. This was not ignorance. This was the most sophisticated understanding of reality available to these people, and it was shared by virtually everyone, from the poorest farmer to the most learned divine. When a cow died mysteriously, it was not simply bad luck. When a child fell ill with symptoms no one could explain, it was not simply disease. When a crop failed, or a well went dry, or a house caught fire for no apparent reason, there was always an explanation available, always a framework that could make sense of the senseless, and that framework said that Satan was at work in the world, operating through human agents, through witches who had signed his book and pledged their souls to his service in exchange for supernatural power. And the terrifying corollary of this belief was that the witch could be anyone. The witch could be your neighbour. The witch could be the woman who sold you milk. The witch could be the old man who lived alone at the edge of the village. The witch could be sitting next to you in meeting on Sunday, reciting prayers with the same mouth that had kissed the devil's hand in the forest at midnight. This was the psychological foundation upon which everything that happened in Salem was built, and you must hold it in your mind as we go forward. You must feel the weight of it, the suffocating certainty that evil was real and present and actively working to destroy everything you loved. Because without understanding this, without truly inhabiting this worldview, nothing that follows will make any sense at all. Now let yourself sink a little deeper into this world, because the fear of the devil was not the only pressure bearing down on the people of Salem village in that terrible winter. The village was a place of deep and bitter division, a community at war with itself in ways that had been festering for years and were now approaching a crisis. At the heart of this division was a simple economic reality. Salem village was a farming community, inland and poor, and Salem town was a commercial centre, coastal and increasingly prosperous, and the people of the village felt, with considerable justification, that they were being exploited and ignored by the people of the town. Salem village had no legal independence. It was technically a part of Salem town, subject to its taxes and its authority, but receiving little in return. The villagers had to travel miles to attend the town's meeting house, miles to conduct any legal business, miles to do anything that required the apparatus of organised society, and they resented it deeply. They had petitioned for years to be allowed to form their own independent township, to have their own church, their own government, their own identity, and they had been repeatedly denied or delayed, or given half measures that satisfied no one. Within the village itself there were factions that mirrored this larger tension. The Putnam family, led by Thomas Putnam, represented the old guard, the original farming families who had settled the village and who felt their way of life was being threatened by the creeping commercialism of Salem town. The Porter family, by contrast, had ties to the town, had prospered through trade and commerce, and represented a vision of the future that the Putnams found threatening and ungodly. These two families and their respective allies had been locked in a power struggle for years, a struggle that played out in every village decision, every appointment, every dispute over land or taxes or the placement of a road. And at the centre of this power struggle, caught in its crossfire and increasingly desperate, was the Reverend Samuel Parris. Parris had come to Salem village in 1689, a failed merchant from Barbados who had turned to the ministry as a second career, and from the beginning his tenure had been contentious. He was a rigid, suspicious, combative man, a man who saw enemies everywhere and who preached sermons that divided the world into the saved and the damned with very little room in between. He had demanded, as a condition of his appointment, that the village grant him ownership of the parsonage and its surrounding land, a demand that was unusual and that many villagers saw as greedy and presumptuous. His salary was a constant source of dispute. The village committee responsible for collecting the taxes that paid his salary was controlled at various times by his allies and his enemies, and when his enemies were in control, the money simply stopped coming. By the winter of 1691, Parris was a man under siege, a man who felt that his livelihood and his authority, and perhaps his very calling, were being undermined by forces within his own congregation, and his sermons had taken on an increasingly dark and apocalyptic tone, full of warnings about the devil's infiltration of the church, about wolves in sheep's clothing, about the need for the faithful to root out the hidden enemies among them. He was priming his congregation, whether consciously or not, to see their social conflicts through the lens of cosmic spiritual warfare, to understand their petty village disputes as battles in the eternal struggle between good and evil. And beyond the village, Beyond even the colony of Massachusetts, there were larger terrors pressing in. King William's War had been raging since 1689, a brutal conflict between English settlers and French forces allied with various Native American tribes, and the frontier of Maine had become a killing ground. Settlements were being raided, families were being massacred, survivors were fleeing south into Essex County with nothing but the clothes on their backs and minds full of horror. These refugees brought with them stories that the people of Salem village heard and absorbed and wove into their existing framework of fear. Stories of midnight attacks, of houses burning, of children carried off into the wilderness, of tortures and cruelties that seemed to confirm everything they already believed about the satanic nature of the world beyond their fragile borders. Some of these refugees ended up in Salem village itself, living as servants or boarders in the homes of villagers, their traumatized presence a constant reminder that the violence of the frontier was not as far away as anyone wanted to believe. Among those who would later become accusers in the witch trials, several had direct experience of frontier violence, had lost parents or siblings in the raids, had been uprooted from their homes and cast into a world of strangers, carrying wounds that no one in 1692 had the language or the framework to understand as what we would now call post-traumatic stress. And as if all of this were not enough, as if the theological terror and the social division and the frontier violence were not sufficient to push a community to the breaking point, there was one more element, perhaps the most destabilizing of all. There was no functioning government. The original colonial charter of Massachusetts, the document that had given the colony its legal authority and its framework of governance, had been revoked by the English Crown in 1684, and although a new charter was being negotiated, it had not yet arrived. This meant that for years the colony had existed in a state of institutional limbo, a state in which the legal authority of every official, every court, every law was technically in question. Trials could not be conducted with full confidence in their legitimacy. Land titles were uncertain. The whole elaborate structure of English law that was supposed to govern their lives was suspended, hovering somewhere over the Atlantic on a ship that never seemed to arrive. For a people who craved order, who believed that social hierarchy and legal structure were ordained by God as bulwarks against chaos, this institutional vacuum was profoundly terrifying. It meant that when the crisis came, when the accusations began and the panic spread, there was no established, trusted mechanism in place to contain it, no court with unquestioned authority to hear the cases, no governor with clear legitimacy to intervene. The machinery of justice would have to be improvised, assembled on the fly by men who were themselves uncertain of their own authority, and that improvisation would prove catastrophic. So hold all of this in your mind as you settle deeper into the dark. Hold the bitter cold and the endless forest and the 4 o'clock darkness. Hold the theology of an ever-present devil, and the certainty that witches walked among the faithful. Hold the village torn between factions, the minister besieged and desperate, the refugees from frontier massacres huddled in borrowed rooms, the absent charter, and the empty throne of a legal authority. Hold all of these pressures simultaneously and understand that this is what a tinderbox looks like, that all of these forces were converging on one small village in one particular winter, and that all it would take was a single spark to set everything ablaze. And the spark, when it came from the most unexpected and most heartbreaking source imaginable. It came from children. In January of 1692, in the parsonage of the Reverend Samuel Parris, something began to happen to his daughter Betty, who was 9 years old, and his niece Abigail Williams, who was 11. The precise nature of what happened to them is something that historians and psychologists have debated for more than 300 years, and we will never know with certainty what was occurring in the minds and bodies of these two girls. But what the adults around them observed was this. The girls began to behave in ways that were profoundly disturbing and completely inexplicable within the framework of anything the community had ever experienced. They screamed. Not the ordinary screams of children at play or children in the grip of a nightmare, but prolonged, agonized screaming that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the throat, screaming that went on until the girls were hoarse and breathless. And still they continued, their mouths open, their eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine terror. They contorted their bodies into positions that seemed impossible, arching their backs until only their heads and heels touched the ground, twisting their limbs at angles that made the adults who watched them cry out in sympathetic pain. They crawled under furniture and into corners and refused to come out, whimpering and covering their heads as if to protect themselves from blows that no one else could see. They claimed to feel invisible hands pinching them, invisible teeth biting them, and sometimes marks appeared on their skin, red welts and bruises that seemed to confirm their claims. They would fall into trances rigid and unresponsive, their eyes open but unseeing, and then suddenly snap back to awareness in a state of wild, incoherent panic. They threw objects. They interrupted prayers, which in a Puritan household was an act of such shocking transgression that it could only be explained by some force operating beyond the girl's own will. They babbled words that made no sense, fragmented phrases and sounds that the adults strained to interpret and could not. Imagine being Samuel Parris, standing in his own home, watching his 9-year-old daughter writhing on the floor, screaming that something was hurting her, something he could not see, and understand that for Parris this was not a medical mystery, not a psychological puzzle, but a spiritual emergency of the highest possible order. His own child in his own house, the house of a minister of God, was being attacked by invisible forces, and everything he believed, everything his education and his faith and his worldview told him, pointed to one explanation. The devil had come to Salem village, and he had come first to the minister's own household, because where better to begin an assault on a godly community than in the home of its spiritual leader? Parris prayed. He fasted. He called in neighbouring ministers to pray with him. He tried every spiritual remedy available to him, and nothing worked. The girl's fits continued, grew worse, grew more dramatic, and began to spread. Ann Putnam Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of Thomas Putnam, began experiencing similar symptoms. So did Elizabeth Hubbard, a 17-year-old servant in the household of Dr. William Griggs. And it was Griggs, the village's only physician, who was called to examine the girls and who delivered the diagnosis that would change everything. Dr. William Griggs was not a sophisticated medical practitioner by any standard. His training was minimal, his knowledge of medicine was rudimentary even by the standards of his own time, and when he examined Betty Parris and Abigail Williams and found no natural cause for their afflictions, no fever, no injury, no disease that he could identify, he reached for the only other explanation his world offered him. He declared that the girls were under an evil hand. 3 words that functioned as a key turning in a lock, opening a door that could not easily be closed again. Because what Griggs was saying, in the language of his time and place, was that the girls were bewitched, that their suffering was being caused not by illness but by witchcraft, that somewhere in Salem village or its surroundings there was a witch who had targeted these children and was tormenting them through supernatural means. And once that diagnosis was spoken aloud, once it entered the consciousness of the community, the question was no longer what was wrong with the girls, but who was doing this to them. The machinery of accusation had been set in motion, and the pressure on the girls to name their tormentors was immediate and immense. Think about what it was like to be Betty Parris, 9 years old, experiencing something terrifying that she could not understand or control, surrounded by adults who were themselves terrified, adults who were praying over her and fasting and weeping and demanding to know who was hurting her, who was the witch, who was the agent of Satan tormenting an innocent child, and understand that this child was being asked to provide an answer to a question that the entire community was desperately waiting to hear. The pressure was not just external, but internal. Betty had been raised to believe in witchcraft, raised to believe that the devil was real, raised in a household where her father preached regularly about the forces of darkness arrayed against the godly. If the doctor said she was bewitched, then she was bewitched, and if she was bewitched, then there must be a witch, and the adults needed her to tell them who it was so they could stop it. In late February of 1692, under this unbearable pressure, the girls began to name names, and the names they chose tell us something profound about the psychology of scapegoating, about how communities under stress select their victims, about who becomes a target when fear goes looking for a face to attach itself to. The first 3 women accused of witchcraft in Salem were Tituba, an enslaved woman of indigenous or African origin who lived in the Parris household; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who wandered from house to house asking for food and shelter and was known for muttering angrily when she was turned away; and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had scandalized the community by living with her indentured servant before marrying him, and who had not attended church in over a year. Look at these 3 women and see what they have in common. Tituba was enslaved, a woman of colour in a community of white English Puritans, a woman with no legal standing, no social power, no family connections to protect her, a woman who was already other in every way that mattered in Salem village. Sarah Good was destitute, dependent on the charity of neighbours who resented her, a woman whose poverty made her both pitiable and contemptible, a woman who was already being treated as though she were cursed. Sarah Osborne was old, ill, socially isolated, a woman who had violated the community's moral standards and then compounded the offence by withdrawing from public worship, a woman who had already placed herself outside the circle of the godly. These were not random choices. These were the most vulnerable people in Salem village, the people with the fewest defenders, the people who were already on the margins, already suspected, already resented, already feared in small, quiet ways that had nothing to do with witchcraft, and everything to do with the human tendency to distrust those who are different, those who do not conform, those who remind us of our own fragility and our own capacity for misfortune. This is the psychology of scapegoating in its purest form. When a community is under unbearable stress, when fear and anger and helplessness build to a point that can no longer be contained, that energy must go somewhere, and it almost always flows downhill toward the people with the least power to resist it. This scapegoat is never the wealthiest or the most powerful or the most connected member of the community. The scapegoat is the beggar woman muttering at your door, the enslaved woman in your minister's kitchen, the old woman who stopped coming to church. The scapegoat is the person you were already uncomfortable with, the person you already avoided, the person whose existence already troubled you in ways you could not quite articulate. Scapegoating takes the diffuse, formless anxiety of a community and gives it a shape, a name, a face, and in doing so it provides a terrible kind of relief, because now the problem is not systemic, not institutional, not theological, not rooted in the failures of the community itself. The problem is her, that woman, that witch, and if we can just remove her, if we can just punish her, if we can just destroy her, then everything will be all right again. It is one of the oldest and most destructive patterns in human psychology, and in Salem village in the winter of 1692, it was about to play out with devastating consequences. On March 1st, 1692, the three accused women were brought before two local magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, for public examination. These were not trials in any formal sense. They were preliminary hearings, intended to determine whether there was sufficient evidence to hold the accused for trial, but they were conducted in a way that made the outcome virtually inevitable. The examinations were held in the village meeting house, which was packed to capacity with villagers who had come to witness what promised to be the most extraordinary event in the history of their small community. The atmosphere was electric with fear and anticipation, and a kind of horrified excitement, the feeling of a community that has been waiting for something terrible to happen, and is almost relieved that it has finally arrived, because at least now the waiting is over, at least now the enemy has been identified, at least now something can be done. Magistrate John Hathorne, great-great-grandfather of the novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne, who would later add a W to the family name as if trying to put distance between himself and his ancestors' legacy, conducted the examinations with a prosecutorial ferocity that left no doubt about where his sympathies lay. He did not question the accused as a neutral investigator seeking the truth. He interrogated them as a man already convinced of their guilt, demanding confessions, hectoring and badgering and twisting their words, treating every denial as further evidence of deception. Sarah Good was brought in first, defiant and angry, insisting on her innocence, and as she stood before the magistrates, the afflicted girls began to scream, to writhe, to contort their bodies in agony, crying out that Good's spectre was tormenting them even as she stood there in the flesh. When Hathorne asked Good what she had done to hurt the children, she said she had done nothing, and the girls screamed louder. When he asked her what evil spirit she was familiar with, she said none, and the girls fell to the floor in apparent convulsions. The entire examination was conducted in this atmosphere of theatrical crisis, with the girls providing a running commentary of invisible torment that made it virtually impossible for anyone in the room to maintain the presumption of innocence. Sarah Osborne was examined next, and the pattern repeated itself. Denial from the accused, screaming and convulsions from the girls, pointed questions from Hathorne that were less questions than accusations. And then came Tituba. What happened when Tituba was brought before the magistrates on that cold March day is one of the most consequential moments in American history, and it is also one of the most psychologically complex and heartbreaking. Tituba confessed. She told the magistrates what they wanted to hear, and in doing so she transformed the Salem witch crisis from a local disturbance into a full-blown catastrophe. Whether Tituba confessed because she had been beaten by Samuel Parris, as some accounts suggest, whether she confessed because she understood with the keen survival instinct of an enslaved person that confession was more likely to save her life than denial, whether she confessed because she had absorbed enough of the Puritan worldview to half believe her own words, or whether she confessed for reasons we can never fully know, the effect of her confession was immediate and devastating. She told the magistrates that the devil had come to her, that he appeared as a tall man dressed in black, that he had shown her a book and asked her to sign it, and that she had seen other names in the book, names she could not read, which meant there were other witches in Salem village, witches whose identities were still unknown, still hidden among the godly, still free to do the devil's work. She described riding through the air on poles, which the listeners understood as a reference to broomsticks. She described seeing animals that served as familiars, a yellow bird and a red cat and a creature she could not quite identify. She described being forced by the devil and by Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne to torment the children against her will. Her testimony was vivid and detailed and utterly compelling to an audience that was primed to believe every word of it, and it accomplished something that no amount of accusation alone could have achieved. It provided confirmation. Up until Tituba's confession, the witch crisis rested entirely on the claims of the afflicted girls. The accused had denied the charges, as you would expect, whether they were guilty or innocent, and there was no independent evidence beyond the girls' fits and the spectral testimony of the girls themselves. But now one of the accused had stood before the magistrates and the community and said, "Yes, it is real. The devil is here. Witchcraft is happening. I have seen it with my own eyes and participated in it with my own hands." Tituba's confession validated everything. It validated the girls' accusations. It validated the community's fears. It validated the theological framework that said the devil was actively working to destroy godly New England. And most dangerously of all, it opened the door to an expansion of the crisis that no one could have predicted. Because Tituba had said there were other names in the devil's book, other witches still at large. And now the question was not whether witchcraft was real, but how far the conspiracy extended, how deep the rot went, how many of the people sitting in the meeting house that day, looking shocked and horrified and righteous, were secretly servants of Satan. The psychology of confession is one of the most studied and most troubling areas of modern psychology, and what happened with Tituba illustrates its power with terrible clarity. When a person confesses, especially a person who has no obvious reason to lie, the confession carries an enormous weight of credibility that can overwhelm all other considerations. We are wired, as social beings, to trust confessions. We believe that people do not normally confess to crimes they did not commit, because why would they? And this belief is so deep and so intuitive that it persists even in the face of overwhelming evidence that false confessions are common, that people confess under pressure and coercion and fear and confusion and mental illness and simple exhaustion, that the human mind under sufficient stress will say anything, admit to anything, fabricate any story that seems likely to bring the immediate suffering to an end. In 1692, no one in Salem village had any understanding of coerced confession. The idea that an innocent person might confess to a crime she did not commit was essentially inconceivable to them. Confession was considered the queen of proofs, the highest and most reliable form of evidence, and Tituba's confession was therefore not just one piece of evidence among many, but the keystone that held the entire arch of accusation together. Without it, the crisis might have sputtered and died. The girls' fits might have faded. The community might have found other explanations, other frameworks, other ways to process its fear and anxiety. But Tituba confessed, and in confessing she made the invisible world visible. She gave substance and detail to what had been vague and uncertain, and she created a narrative that the community could rally around and act upon with the full force of its collective terror. And something else happened in those early examinations, something subtle but profoundly important for understanding how the crisis escalated. The afflicted girls discovered that their fits had power. In ordinary life, these were children and adolescents with no authority, no voice, no influence over the adult world that controlled every aspect of their existence. A 9-year-old girl in Puritan New England was expected to be silent, obedient, dutiful, invisible. But in the meeting house, when the girls screamed and writhed and pointed their fingers at the accused, every adult in the room paid attention. The most powerful men in the community, magistrates and ministers and heads of great families, leaned forward and listened and took their words seriously and acted on them. The girls had stumbled into a kind of power that was unprecedented in their experience, the power to command the attention of the entire community, the power to determine the fate of adults, the power to be not just heard but believed and feared and obeyed. This is not to say that the girls were simply performing, simply pretending, simply manipulating their elders in a calculated bid for attention. The truth is almost certainly more complicated and more sympathetic than that. Some of them may have been genuinely experiencing symptoms of psychological distress, symptoms that we might now recognize as conversion disorder or mass psychogenic illness, symptoms that were real and frightening and beyond their conscious control. Some of them may have begun with genuine distress and then found that the role of afflicted person offered them a kind of agency, an importance they had never known, and the line between genuine experience and performance may have blurred until they themselves could not have said where one ended and the other began. Some of them may have been caught up in a social dynamic that made it impossible to stop. Because once you have accused someone of witchcraft, once the community has acted on your accusation, once a woman is sitting in chains because of your words, you cannot easily recant without destroying yourself, without admitting that you're either a liar or a fool, without bringing down upon your own head the wrath of a community that has invested its fears and its hopes in your testimony. The girls were trapped, in a sense, by their own power, locked into a role that demanded escalation because anything less than escalation would mean admitting that the whole terrible enterprise was built on sand. And so the examinations continued, and the circle of accusation began to widen. After Tituba's confession, after the initial shock and horror and grim satisfaction of having identified the enemy, the community did not calm down. It did the opposite. If there were other names in the devil's book, then there were other witches to find. If the devil had infiltrated Salem village, then no one was above suspicion. The afflicted girls, emboldened by the response to their initial accusations, began to see spectres everywhere, began to name new tormentors, and each new name sent a fresh wave of panic through the village, because each new name meant the conspiracy was larger than anyone had imagined. The danger was greater. The devil's reach was longer. Ann Putnam Jr. accused Martha Corey, a full member of the church, a respectable woman, a woman whose accusation would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier, and the fact that even a church member could be named meant that the protective walls of piety and social standing were no longer barriers, meant that the witch could truly be anyone, meant that the only people you could trust were the people who were actively and visibly fighting against the witches, and the most visible fighters were the afflicted girls themselves. In the cold, dark days of early March 1692, as the examinations of the first 3 accused women were still underway, as Tituba's confession echoed through the village like a bell that would not stop ringing, the people of Salem village stood at the edge of an abyss they could not yet see. They believed they were doing the right thing. They believed they were protecting their children, defending their community, fighting the devil with the weapons God had given them, with prayer and vigilance and the righteous authority of the magistrate's bench. They could not know that they were at the beginning of something that would consume their village and their colony, that would destroy families and end lives and leave a stain on their community so deep that more than 3 centuries later it would still be the first thing anyone thought of when they heard the name Salem. They could not know that the mechanisms they had set in motion, the theological certainty and the social pressure and the legal machinery, and the terrible, intoxicating power of accusation, these mechanisms had no natural stopping point, no built-in brake, no way to slow down once they had begun to accelerate. They were passengers in a vehicle of their own construction, hurtling toward a destination they could not yet imagine. And the road ahead was dark, and the darkness was full of screaming, and the screaming would not stop for months to come. So let that image settle over you as you rest. The image of a small village in a vast darkness, a community turned in upon itself, children pointing fingers and adults scrambling to respond. An enslaved woman spinning stories of the devil in a crowded meeting house, magistrates leaning forward with terrible eagerness, and beneath it all, beneath the theology and the politics and the personal grudges and the frontier terror, beneath all the specific historical circumstances that made Salem village in 1692, the place where this particular horror took root, beneath all of that, the oldest and most universal of human impulses, The need to find someone to blame when the world becomes too frightening to bear. The need to believe that if you can just identify the source of the evil and destroy it, then safety will return, order will be restored, the darkness will recede, and you will be able to sleep again without dreaming of the devil walking among the trees outside your window, patient and smiling, waiting for someone to open the door. And so the confession hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, curling through the frozen lanes of Salem village, seeping under door frames and into the restless dreams of every soul who heard it. Repeated and repeated it was, again and again, in hushed voices at the meeting house, in the dim flicker of hearthlight, in the sharp whispers exchanged between neighbours who had once trusted each other without question. Because Tituba had done the unthinkable, she had confirmed what they feared most. She had told them that yes, the devil walked among them, that she had seen his book and that other names were written inside it, names she could not or would not speak aloud, and that single detail, that terrible open-endedness, was the crack in the dam through which everything that followed would pour. Because if there were other names, then there were other witches, and if there were other witches, then no one at all, could be certain they were safe. Let yourself breathe slowly as we move deeper into this story, because what happened next in Salem is not merely a historical event, it is a mirror held up to the architecture of the human mind, to the way fear operates when it is given permission to grow without restraint. And in those first days of March 1692, fear had been given every permission it needed. The afflicted girls, those young bodies twisted by invisible torments, had already named 3 women, and 2 of those women fit neatly into the roles the community expected of a witch: the beggar and the slave, the marginal and the foreign. But Tituba's confession had whispered of more, and so the girls began to look beyond the edges of society, and what they saw, or what they claimed to see, would change the meaning of the accusations entirely. Martha Corey was not a beggar, she was not an outsider, she was a full covenanted member of the Salem village church, a woman who sat in the pews on the Sabbath with her head bowed in prayer, a woman who owned property and kept a respectable household, and when her name first surfaced in connection with the afflictions, it sent a tremor through the community that the first 3 accusations had not. Because if Martha Corey could be a witch, then the boundary between the godly and the wicked was not where anyone had drawn it. The line had moved, or perhaps there had never been a line at all. Martha Corey had made a mistake, a small one by any rational measure but fatal in the atmosphere of Salem. She had been sceptical, she had expressed doubt about the validity of the girls' afflictions, she had suggested that perhaps too much attention was being paid to their fits and their visions, and in a community that had already committed itself to believing those fits were real, skepticism was not merely unwelcome, it was suspicious, because why would someone doubt the existence of witchcraft unless they themselves had reason to want the investigations to stop? This is a pattern that repeats throughout human history with a regularity that should unsettle us, and you can let your mind drift across the centuries as you consider it, because it is the same pattern that emerges in every moral panic, every inquisition, every period of political purging. The moment you question the premise, you become the enemy. The act of doubt is reframed as evidence of guilt, and once that transformation occurs, there is no safe place to stand except in full-throated agreement with the accusers. Martha Corey was examined on March 21st, 1692, and the scene in the meeting house was unlike anything Salem had witnessed before, because the afflicted girls performed with an intensity that seemed to grow in proportion to the respectability of the accused. They writhed and screamed and claimed to see Martha's spectre flying through the rafters, pinching them, choking them, pressing the devil's book into their hands. And when Martha moved her hands or shifted her weight, the girls mimicked her movements as though controlled by invisible strings, and the crowd watched in horrified fascination, packed shoulder to shoulder in that cold wooden room, their breath hanging in the March air as the line between the pious and the damned dissolved before their eyes, and something shifted in the collective consciousness of Salem that day, something that could not be shifted back, because the community had crossed an invisible threshold. They had accused one of their own respectable members, and the world had not ended. The sky had not fallen, and so the next accusation would come more easily, and the one after that more easily still. And if Martha Corey's accusation had shaken the foundations of trust in Salem, what came next brought them crumbling down entirely, because the girls soon turned their spectral sight upon Rebecca Nurse. And if you had been a villager in Salem in the spring of 1692, and someone had told you that Rebecca Nurse would be accused of witchcraft, you would not have believed it. You might have laughed or wept, because Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old. She was frail and partially deaf. She was known throughout the community as a woman of deep and genuine piety, a loving mother and grandmother, a gentle presence whose life had been one of quiet devotion, and to accuse her was to accuse goodness itself. It was to say that the devil's reach extended not merely to the margins but to the very heart of Christian virtue. Rebecca Nurse's accusation marked the true point of no return, the moment at which the Salem witch trials ceased to be a local disturbance and became something vast and uncontrollable, because her arrest told every person in the community a single devastating message: that no amount of righteousness could protect you, that your lifetime of prayer and charity and faithfulness meant nothing if a group of convulsing girls pointed their fingers in your direction, and the psychological effect of this realization was profound. It did not make people question the accusations. Instead, it deepened their terror, because if even Rebecca Nurse could be in league with the devil, then the conspiracy was larger and more insidious than anyone had imagined, and the only response to a larger conspiracy was more vigilance, more suspicion, more accusations. Now let your breathing settle even deeper as we consider something that may disturb you, something that reveals just how far the machinery of accusation had gone, because among those accused in these early weeks was a child, Dorothy Good, the daughter of Sarah Good, and Dorothy was 4 years old, some accounts say 5, a tiny girl who had been living in destitution with her mother, begging from house to house, sleeping in barns and ditches, and when the afflicted girls claimed that little Dorothy's spectre was tormenting them, the authorities did not pause. They did not say that surely this had gone too far. They arrested her, they examined her, and the child, confused and frightened and desperate to please the adults who loomed over her with their questions, told them what they wanted to hear. She said that yes, she had a little snake that sucked on her finger, and the examiners looked at her hand and found a small red mark, the kind of mark that any child might have from a scratch or a bug bite, and they recorded it as evidence of a witch's familiar, and Dorothy Good was placed in chains, actual iron chains, in Boston jail, where she would remain for months in the darkness, and when she was finally released she was, according to her father's later testimony, permanently damaged, a broken child who would never recover from what had been done to her. And if you want to understand the true cost of a moral panic, do not count only the dead, count the children who were swallowed by it and emerged as something less than whole. Count the minds that were shattered by the weight of adult cruelty dressed in the language of righteousness. There is a psychological principle at work here that researchers have studied extensively, and it is called escalating commitment, or sometimes the foot in the door effect, and it describes the way that each step along a path makes the next step easier, more natural, more inevitable, because once you have accepted the premise that 3 women in your community are witches, it is only a small step to accept that a 4th might be as well, and once you have accepted 4, the 5th requires even less evidence. And by the time you have accused 10, 20, 50 people, the act of accusation has become routine, normalized, a reflex rather than a deliberation, and the original threshold, the amount of evidence or suspicion you once required before you would condemn another human being, has eroded to nothing, washed away by repetition. And this is how ordinary communities produce extraordinary horrors, not through a single dramatic decision, but through a long series of small surrenders, each one barely noticeable in itself, until you look up and realize that you have imprisoned a 4-year-old child for witchcraft, and no one in a position of authority has said stop. Let us turn now to the afflicted girls themselves, because their role in this story is perhaps the most psychologically fascinating of all, and as you lie there in the quiet and the dark, let your mind hold the complexity of what they were, because they were not simply liars, and they were not simply victims, they were something more intricate and more human than either of those categories allows. They were young people caught in a web of social forces that modern psychology is only beginning to fully understand. The question that historians and psychologists have debated for centuries is deceptively simple. Were the afflicted girls faking it? And the honest answer, the one that respects the full weight of the evidence and the full depth of human psychology, is that the truth probably exists in a space that the word faking does not capture, a grey territory between deliberate deception and genuine experience. A place where the body and the mind conspire to produce something that is simultaneously performed and felt, and understanding this requires us to abandon the neat binary of real versus fake and enter the far more unsettling territory of human psychology as it actually operates. Consider what modern psychology calls mass psychogenic illness, sometimes still referred to as mass hysteria. Though that term carries its own problematic history, this is a well-documented phenomenon in which groups of people, usually in close contact and under significant stress, develop real physical symptoms, convulsions, fainting, pain, nausea, that have no identifiable organic cause. The symptoms are not imaginary. The people experiencing them genuinely feel them. Their bodies genuinely produce them. But the origin is psychological rather than physical, rooted in anxiety and social contagion, and the extraordinary power of suggestion, and outbreaks of mass psychogenic illness have been documented across cultures and centuries, from medieval dancing plagues to episodes in modern factories and schools, and in every case the pattern is remarkably similar. It begins with one or two individuals, it spreads through a close-knit group, the symptoms intensify as they receive attention, and they resolve when the social conditions that produce them change. The girls of Salem fit this pattern with eerie precision. They were young, they were female in a society that gave females almost no agency or voice. They were living through a period of extraordinary communal stress. With war on the frontier and political uncertainty and theological anxiety pressing in from every direction, and they were embedded in a culture that believed absolutely in the reality of the invisible world, a culture that had primed them from birth to understand physical suffering as evidence of spiritual warfare. And when the first fits began, whether they originated in genuine distress or childhood performance or some mixture of both, the community's response created a feedback loop that made it nearly impossible for the symptoms to stop. This is where the concept of conversion disorder becomes relevant, a condition in which psychological distress is converted into physical symptoms, paralysis, blindness, seizures, that are entirely real to the person experiencing them but have no neurological basis, and conversion disorder is profoundly influenced by cultural context. The symptoms that manifest tend to be the symptoms that the surrounding culture recognizes and validates, and in Puritan New England, the recognized symptoms of bewitchment were fits, contortions, the sensation of being pinched or bitten by invisible hands, and so those were precisely the symptoms the girls produced, not because they were consciously choosing to produce them, or at least not entirely, but because their minds, under extreme stress and shaped by the beliefs of their world, generated the physical experiences that their world expected. But there is another layer to this, and it is the layer of social reinforcement, because every time one of the afflicted girls had a fit, she was rewarded, not with money or material goods, but with something far more valuable. In a society that had rendered her invisible, she was rewarded with attention, with sympathy, with power. These were girls and young women who in the ordinary course of Puritan life would have had almost no voice, no influence, no ability to shape the world around them. They were expected to be silent, obedient, subordinate, and suddenly they were the most important people in the room. Magistrates listened to them, ministers deferred to them, entire courtrooms fell silent when they spoke, and the psychological term for this is secondary gain. The unintended benefits that a person receives from being ill or afflicted, and secondary gain is a powerful reinforcer. It does not mean the person is faking. It means that the unconscious mind has discovered that symptoms produce rewards, and so the symptoms persist and intensify. And this is not a moral failing. It is a feature of human psychology that operates in all of us, in ways large and small every single day. And there was one more force binding the girls to their role, one more chain that they could not easily break, and it was the most terrifying force of all, because once you were among the afflicted, once you had named names and given testimony, and sent your neighbours to jail, you could not simply stop. You could not wake up one morning and say that you had been mistaken, that the spectres were not real, that the whole thing had been an error, because to recant would be to admit that you had caused innocent people to be imprisoned. And more than that, to stop having fits while others continued to have them, would invite a question that no one in Salem wanted directed at them. The question of why. Why have your symptoms ceased? Have you perhaps made your own bargain with the devil? Have you signed his book in exchange for relief from your torments? And so the girls were trapped, locked into their performance, by the same machinery of suspicion that they had helped to create. And this is one of the cruelest ironies of Salem, that the accusers were in their own way as imprisoned as the accused, unable to escape a role that had begun to consume them entirely. Now let us consider the legal mechanism that made all of this possible, the single most important and most destructive concept in the Salem witch trials, and that is spectral evidence. The idea that the spirit or spectre of a witch could leave their physical body and travel invisibly to torment their victims, and the afflicted girls claimed to see these spectres constantly. They would point to empty air and scream that they could see the ghostly form of the accused hovering above them, biting them, choking them, and the question that spectral evidence raised was one of the most consequential theological and legal questions of the 17th century. Could the devil use the shape of an innocent person, without that person's knowledge or consent? Could the devil project your image into the eyes of a suffering child, even if you yourself were guiltless? And the answer to this question determined everything, because if the devil could only use the shapes of those who had consented to serve him, then spectral evidence was reliable. If you saw someone's spectre, it proved they were a witch. But if the devil could use anyone's image freely, then spectral evidence proved nothing at all. It was just the devil playing tricks. And the most influential minister in New England, Cotton Mather, the brilliant and tortured son of Increase Mather, took what appeared to be a careful middle position. He acknowledged that the devil might indeed be able to use an innocent person's form, and he cautioned the courts not to rely too heavily on spectral evidence alone. But his caution was hedged and qualified and ultimately ineffective, because the judges of Salem heard what they wanted to hear. They seized upon spectral evidence as their primary tool of conviction, and they built an entire judicial process around a form of evidence that was, by its very nature, impossible to verify, impossible to challenge, and impossible to disprove. Think about what this meant for the accused. Let it settle into your mind as you rest there in the darkness, because spectral evidence destroyed the very concept of defense. If someone claimed to see your spectre tormenting them, how could you prove they were wrong? You could not produce an alibi for your spirit. You could not demonstrate that your spectral form had been elsewhere at the time of the alleged attack. The evidence existed entirely within the mind of the accuser. It was subjective, unfalsifiable, immune to contradiction, and the accused were left standing before the court with no weapon and no shield, able to say nothing except "I am innocent," which was precisely what a witch would say, and the fits of the afflicted girls performed live in the courtroom provided all the spectacle the judges needed to confirm what they had already decided to believe. This is a pattern that extends far beyond Salem, and as your body grows heavier and your thoughts grow softer, consider how many times in human history people have been condemned on evidence that exists only in the mind of the accuser, evidence that cannot be tested or questioned, evidence that is accepted precisely because it cannot be disproven. And you will find that spectral evidence has many descendants, many modern forms, and that the fundamental problem it represents, the problem of how society handles accusations that are by their nature unverifiable, is a problem we have never fully solved, and perhaps never will, because it sits at the intersection of justice and epistemology, at the place where what we believe and what we can prove are separated by a gap that no legal system has ever completely bridged. And woven through all of this, like a dark thread in an already dark tapestry, was the confession paradox, one of the most psychologically perverse features of the entire Salem episode. Because as the accusations multiplied and the jails began to fill, a pattern emerged that defied all rational expectation. Those who confessed to being witches were spared, their cases were continued, they were kept alive as witnesses, as resources for identifying other witches, while those who maintained their innocence, who stood before the court and said, "I am no witch, I am innocent, I know nothing of it," were the ones who were convicted and condemned to die. Breathe with that for a moment. Because the full weight of its cruelty takes time to absorb, the system had created an incentive structure in which the only way to survive was to lie, to confess to a crime you had not committed, to say, "Yes, I signed the devil's book. Yes, I flew through the night on a pole. Yes, I tormented those children," to fabricate details and name other names and add your voice to the chorus of falsehood, because the reward for lying was your life, and the reward for telling the truth was the gallows, and this was not an accident or an oversight. It was the logical endpoint of a system that had defined guilt and innocence in terms of compliance, a system that valued the narrative of conspiracy more than it valued individual human lives, and the perverse beauty of it, if we can call it beauty, was that it was self-sustaining. Each confession fed the machine, justified the machine, made the machine hungrier. And people confessed. Over 50 people confessed to practicing witchcraft during the Salem trials, and each confession, each new voice saying, "Yes, it is all true, I am a witch, and there are others," reinforced the collective belief that the conspiracy was real, that the devil's assault on New England was vast and coordinated, because why would so many people confess if it were not true? And the answer that the people of Salem could not see because they were inside the system, was that the confessions were produced by the system itself, manufactured by terror and the rational calculation of people who understood that the truth would kill them. Modern psychology has studied false confessions extensively, and what researchers have found resonates deeply with what happened in Salem, because people confess to crimes they did not commit far more often than most of us would like to believe, and they do so under conditions of extreme stress, sleep deprivation, prolonged interrogation, the threat of severe punishment, the presence of seemingly irrefutable evidence against them, and the suggestion, whether explicit or implicit, that confessing will lead to better treatment, and all of these conditions were present in Salem in 1692. The accused were held in cramped and filthy jails. They were examined repeatedly by magistrates who made clear from the outset that they believed the accused to be guilty. They were confronted with the screaming, writhing bodies of the afflicted girls as evidence of their crimes, and they were surrounded by the knowledge that those who confessed were surviving while those who did not were being condemned. And under these conditions, confession was not an act of honesty or spiritual submission. It was an act of survival, a rational response to an irrational system. And the tragedy is that each act of survival made the system stronger, more certain of itself, more hungry for the next accusation and the next confession. By May of 1692, the afflictions and the accusations had burst the boundaries of Salem village like a river overflowing its banks, spreading outward into the surrounding communities with a momentum that seemed to have no natural limit, and the towns of Andover and Topsfield and Ipswich and even distant Boston found themselves caught in the expanding web of suspicion, because the afflicted girls had become celebrities of a kind. Their reputation for detecting witches had spread throughout Essex County and beyond, and officials from other towns began to invite them, to bring them in as consultants, as spiritual diagnosticians, to point their trembling fingers at the hidden witches in their own communities, and the girls obliged because the role had become their identity, their source of power, their reason for being, and everywhere they went, they found more witches, because that is what they had been brought to find. In Andover, the constable's wife fell ill, and the town leaders, hearing of the afflicted girls' abilities, sent for them, and the girls arrived and performed their terrible theatre, and within weeks, Andover had more accused witches per capita than Salem itself. Dozens of people in a single town, neighbours accusing neighbours in a cascade of terror that followed the same psychological patterns that had played out in Salem but compressed into a shorter span, as though the mechanism of accusation had become more efficient with practice, more streamlined, more sure of itself, and this efficiency was itself a form of psychological momentum. The more accusations the system processed, the less friction each new accusation encountered, until the act of pointing a finger and saying which had become almost casual, almost routine, stripped of the gravity it once carried. And throughout this expansion, the tools of detection grew more elaborate and more absurd, and one of the most revealing was the touch test, which operated on the principle that if an afflicted person was suffering a fit, and the accused witch touched them, the fit would stop because the malign energy would flow back into the witch's body, and this was presented as an objective empirical test, a way of confirming guilt through physical evidence. But consider how the test actually worked in practice. The afflicted girl would be writhing on the floor, the accused would be brought forward and made to touch her, and the girl would grow calm and everyone would nod and say yes, there it is, proof of guilt. But what they had actually witnessed was a girl who stopped performing when the expected cue arrived, or a girl whose genuine psychosomatic symptoms resolved when the social script called for them to resolve, and the test could never fail. It could never produce an innocent result. Because if the afflicted person did not calm down when touched, that simply meant the devil was being especially cunning. And so either outcome confirmed guilt, and this is the purest expression of confirmation bias imaginable, a test designed so that every possible result points to the same conclusion. And the people of 1692 Massachusetts did not see the circularity because they were not looking for it. They were looking for witches, and they had built a machine that could find nothing else. By this time, over 150 people had been accused. The jails were filling beyond capacity. Men and women and children crammed into small dark spaces chained to walls, some of them sick, some of them dying, all of them waiting for a judicial process that did not yet properly exist, because the colony of Massachusetts Bay had been operating under a legal limbo. The old charter had been revoked, and the new one had not yet arrived, and without a charter, there was no legal framework for conducting trials, and so the accused simply waited, in chains, in darkness, while the machinery of accusation continued to grind forward without pause. And the conditions in those jails were themselves a form of torture. The cold, the filth, the rats, the chains that bit into wrists and ankles, the darkness that erased the boundary between day and night, and some of the accused were elderly, some were pregnant, some were children, and they suffered together in that darkness, waiting for a system that had already decided their fate before it had even been formally constituted. And then, in May of 1692, the new governor arrived, Sir William Phipps, a man of extraordinary personal history, born poor on the Maine frontier, risen to knighthood through a combination of ambition and luck, most notably his recovery of a sunken Spanish treasure ship, and Phipps carried with him the new charter that would re-establish the legal government of Massachusetts Bay, and he stepped off his ship into a colony that was consuming itself, a colony with jails overflowing with accused witches and no court to try them, and Phipps, who was not a legal scholar and not a theologian and not particularly interested in the complexities of spectral evidence, did what seemed to him the practical thing. He created a special court, the Court of Oyez and Termina, a legal phrase meaning to hear and determine, and he appointed judges to sit on this court, and the man he placed at its head, the Chief Justice who would preside over the trials that followed, was William Stoughton, and this choice, perhaps more than any other single decision, sealed the fate of the accused. William Stoughton was a man of rigid convictions and absolute certainty, a former minister who had turned to law and politics, but who carried with him a minister's unshakable sense of moral clarity, and Stoughton believed in the reality of the witchcraft conspiracy with a fervour that left no room for doubt or mercy. He believed that spectral evidence was reliable, that the devil could not use the image of an innocent person, and therefore that the testimony of the afflicted was essentially proof of guilt, and he ran his courtroom accordingly, not as a forum for the careful weighing of evidence, but as a mechanism for processing the guilty, for moving them efficiently from accusation to conviction, to the sentence that he believed God and justice demanded. The Court of Oyez and Termina was not designed for acquittal. It was not designed to protect the rights of the accused. It was designed to address what the authorities perceived as an emergency, a spiritual crisis that required swift and decisive action, and in this it reflected a pattern that appears whenever societies feel threatened: the willingness to sacrifice procedural safeguards in the name of security, the belief that extraordinary times require extraordinary measures and that the normal protections of law are luxuries that cannot be afforded when the enemy is at the gates, and the people of Massachusetts in 1692 believed absolutely that the enemy was at the gates, that Satan himself was waging war against their holy experiment, and in that belief they handed their neighbours' lives to a court that was designed from its inception to take them. And this is perhaps the most important lesson Salem has to teach us, that the erosion of justice does not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happens incrementally, one compromise at a time, one exception at a time, one emergency measure that becomes permanent, one safeguard that is quietly set aside because the threat seems too urgent to allow for caution, and by the time anyone realizes what has been lost, the machinery is already in motion, and stopping it requires a courage that most people do not possess. And so, as the spring of 1692 gave way to the early warmth of summer, Salem stood at the threshold of something that could not be taken back. The jails were full to bursting. The afflicted girls were at the height of their terrible power. The legal machinery was in place. The judges were appointed and the confessions kept coming, each one adding another stone to the wall of certainty that the community had built around itself. And somewhere in that wall were buried the doubts, the whispered questions, the uneasy sense that something had gone wrong. But the wall was too thick now, too high, too solid, and the people who might have spoken were too afraid, because they had seen what happened to those who questioned. They had seen Martha Corey dragged from her pew. They had seen Rebecca Nurse pulled from her sickbed. They had seen a 4-year-old child fitted with irons, and they understood in the deepest and most primal part of their minds that safety lay only in silence, only in agreement, only in adding your voice to the chorus rather than raising it in dissent. The first session of the Court of Oyez and Termina was set for June 2nd, 1692, and the accused waited in their cells, some praying, some weeping, some sitting in a stunned silence that had replaced all other emotion, and the community waited too, believing that the trials would bring resolution, that the court would separate the guilty from the innocent and restore the order that had been shattered. But what was coming was not resolution. It was something far darker, because the court was about to demonstrate that when a legal system is built on a foundation of fear and false evidence, it does not find truth, it manufactures death. And the first person to learn this lesson, the first to walk the path from the courtroom to the gallows, was already sitting in a cold cell, waiting for a justice that would never come. Let yourself drift now. Let the weight of this story settle into the quiet spaces of your mind, because what you have heard tonight is the story of how fear builds upon itself, how accusation breeds accusation, how a community can construct an entire architecture of belief that is perfectly internally consistent and perfectly, catastrophically wrong. And the people of Salem were not monsters. They were not fundamentally different from you or from anyone you know. They were human beings operating within the limits of human psychology, subject to the same biases, the same fears, the same desperate need to make sense of a world that felt dangerous and uncertain. And what they built in the spring of 1692, that machinery of suspicion and confession and spectral proof, was not an aberration of human nature but an expression of it, a dark expression, a terrible one, but one that lives in the architecture of every human mind, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. And as you rest here in the stillness, as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to blur at the edges, carry with you the knowledge that the distance between civilization and Salem is not as great as we would like to believe, that the same forces are always present, always waiting, and that the only defense against them is the willingness to say stop, to say I doubt, to say show me the evidence, even when saying those things is the most dangerous thing a person can do. The court had been given its name and its authority, and now in the first days of June 1692, with the air thickening into the wet heaviness of a New England summer, the machinery of judgment began to turn, slowly at first, like a millstone finding its rhythm, and the first soul fed into that grinding apparatus was a woman named Bridget Bishop, a woman who had lived on the margins of respectability for years, a woman who owned a tavern where cider flowed and laughter carried too late into the evening, a woman who dressed not in the muted greys and browns that Puritan modesty demanded, but in a red bodice, a shocking, defiant splash of colour against the drab palette of Salem. And you might pause here, letting your mind settle into the strangeness of it, the idea that a piece of clothing could seal a person's fate, but in a world where outward appearance was read as an index of the soul, where every gesture and garment was scrutinized for signs of spiritual allegiance, that red bodice was not merely fabric and thread, but a declaration, a provocation, a confirmation of everything the community already suspected about the woman who wore it. For Bridget Bishop had been accused of witchcraft once before, back in 1680, and though she had escaped conviction then, the accusation clung to her like smoke, never fully dissipating, always hovering at the edges of her reputation. And so when the Court of Oyer and Terminer convened on the 2nd of June to hear its very first case, it was no accident that Bridget Bishop was the one brought before the judges. She was the test case, the easiest target, the person whose conviction would require the least persuasion, the least stretching of credulity, because the community had already been rehearsing her guilt for over a decade, and the trial itself unfolded with the strange dreamlike efficiency that would come to characterize all the proceedings that summer. The afflicted girls writhing and screaming in the courtroom, claiming that Bishop's spectre was pinching them, biting them, tormenting them even as the woman herself stood perfectly still before the bar, and workmen testified that they had found poppets, small cloth dolls stuck with pins hidden inside the walls of her former home, and neighbours recounted strange misfortunes that had befallen them after quarrels with Bishop, a sick child here, a dead cow there, and the jury deliberated and returned with the word that everyone expected, guilty. And 8 days later, on the 10th of June, Bridget Bishop was led to a rocky outcropping that would come to be known as Gallows Hill, and there, with the summer sun pressing down and the crowd gathered in a silence that was not quite solemn and not quite festive, but something more unsettling, something closer to the hush of an audience watching a play whose ending they already know. A rope was placed around her neck and she was hanged until she was dead. And with that single death, a threshold was crossed that could never be uncrossed. For now, the court had proven that it would do what courts of this nature always do, when given sufficient power and insufficient restraint. It would kill, and having killed once, having demonstrated that the machinery worked, that an accusation could travel the full distance from whispered suspicion to the tightening of a noose, the next killing would be easier, and the one after that easier still, because this is one of the darkest truths about human violence, that each act of it lowers the barrier to the next, that the first transgression is always the hardest, and every subsequent transgression requires less justification, less deliberation, less of whatever internal resistance once held the violence in check. And so as June wore on and the heat deepened and the jails continued to fill with men and women and even children awaiting trial, the court moved forward with a momentum that felt less like justice and more like gravity, less like deliberation and more like inevitability. And then came the 19th of June, a date that deserves to be spoken slowly and held in the mind like a stone held in the palm, because on that day 5 people were hanged together, 5 at once, and among them was a woman whose story cuts deeper than perhaps any other in this entire dark chronicle, a woman named Rebecca Nurse. And to understand why her case matters so profoundly, you must understand who she was. Not a marginal figure like Bridget Bishop, not someone the community had already half condemned, but a 71-year-old grandmother, a woman of deep and genuine piety, a full member of the church in good standing, beloved by her neighbours, respected by her community, a woman whose life had been a quiet testament to everything Puritan society claimed to value. And yet the accusations came for her too, because the logic of the witch hunt had its own terrible momentum, its own internal gravity that pulled everyone toward the centre, regardless of their virtue or their standing. And when Rebecca Nurse was brought to trial, the courtroom was filled with a tension that had not been present at Bishop's proceedings, because many people in that room knew in some deep unspoken place that this woman was not a witch, that this frail grandmother, who could barely hear the charges being read against her, had done nothing to deserve the fate that was closing around her like a fist. And the jury, those 12 men tasked with weighing the evidence and rendering judgment, they felt that tension too, and when they retired to deliberate they did something remarkable, something that might have changed the course of everything that followed. They returned with a verdict of not guilty, and for one trembling moment the entire machinery of persecution seemed to stutter, seemed to catch on something hard and immovable. Because if Rebecca Nurse was not guilty, then the afflicted girls had lied or been deceived, and if the girls had lied or been deceived, then every conviction that rested on their testimony was called into question. And if every conviction was called into question, then the court itself was called into question. And if the court was called into question, then the judges and the ministers and the magistrates who had set this entire apparatus in motion were called into question. And you can feel it even now across the centuries, that moment of vertigo, that brief, terrifying glimpse of what it would mean for the community to admit that it had been wrong, and it was into that vertigo that the afflicted girls screamed. They screamed and writhed and convulsed with a violence that shook the courtroom, their bodies arching and twisting as if invisible hands were tearing at their flesh. And Chief Justice William Stoughton, a man whose rigid certainty had been the backbone of the court from the beginning, a man who had never once shown any flicker of doubt about the righteousness of these proceedings, turned to the jury and sent them back to reconsider their verdict. And this is a moment that deserves the full weight of psychological understanding, because what happened next in that jury room was not simply a legal proceeding, but a demonstration of one of the most powerful and most dangerous forces in human social life, the force of conformity under pressure, the force that Solomon Asch would document in his famous experiments 2.5 centuries later, where ordinary people would deny the evidence of their own eyes rather than contradict the unanimous opinion of a group. And these 12 jurors had just witnessed the most powerful authority figure in the courtroom expressing his clear displeasure with their verdict, had just heard the anguished screaming of the girls whose suffering they were supposed to be alleviating, had just felt the weight of an entire community's expectation pressing down on them like stones on a chest. And so they deliberated again, and this time they returned with a different word. Guilty, and Rebecca Nurse was led to Gallows Hill alongside Susanna Martin and Sarah Wilds, and Sarah Good and Elizabeth Howe. 5 women hanged on a single day, and Sarah Good, defiant to the end, reportedly turned to the Reverend Nicholas Noyes as the noose was fitted around her neck and said, "If you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Words that would echo through the years like a prophecy, like a curse, like the last utterance of a woman who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. And the 5 bodies hung in the summer air, as the crowd dispersed and the birds wheeled overhead, and the court adjourned for the day. Its work proceeding with the grim regularity of a harvest. But August brought a case that would test even the most committed believers in the court's authority, for among those accused and brought to trial was a man named George Burroughs, and Burroughs was no ordinary defendant. He was a former minister of Salem village itself, a Harvard-educated clergyman who had served the community years earlier before departing under difficult circumstances, and the accusation against him was not merely that he practiced witchcraft, but that he was the ringleader, the master of the coven, the dark minister who presided over the witches' sabbaths in the forest, a kind of inverted mirror image of the godly ministers who presided over the congregations in their meeting houses, and this accusation served a deep psychological need within the community, because it provided a satisfying explanation for the scope and persistence of the crisis. If the witches had a leader, a organizer, a figure of authority guiding their malefic work, then the sheer scale of the affliction made more sense. It was not random chaos but organized evil, and Burroughs was brought to trial and convicted on the 19th of August, and he was led to Gallows Hill alongside John Proctor and John Willard, and George Jacobs and Martha Carrier. 5 more souls added to the growing toll, but what happened at the gallows that day became one of the most famous moments in the entire history of the trials. For as George Burroughs stood with the rope around his neck, facing death with a composure that unsettled everyone who watched, he began to speak, and what he spoke were the words of the Lord's Prayer, recited perfectly, without hesitation, without error, every syllable falling from his lips with the measured cadence of a man who had spent his life in the service of those words. And this mattered enormously, because it was widely believed, deeply believed with the certainty of Scripture itself, that a witch could not recite the Lord's Prayer, that the devil's servants would stumble over the sacred words, that their tongues would twist and falter when confronted with the holiness of that particular prayer. And yet here was George Burroughs, condemned as the very prince of witches, speaking those words with flawless precision, and the crowd that had gathered to watch him die began to shift and murmur, began to feel something cracking in the foundation of their certainty, and some accounts say that tears were streaming down the faces of the spectators, that the mood on Gallows Hill was tilting towards something that looked very much like doubt, very much like the beginning of a collective reckoning, and for the second time in this terrible summer, the entire machinery of persecution seemed to shudder and slow, seemed to approach the edge of its own undoing, and it was at this precise moment that a figure on horseback pushed through the crowd, a figure whose name carried more authority in Puritan New England than almost any other. Cotton Mather, minister, scholar, son of Increase Mather, who was the president of Harvard College, the most prominent intellectual defender of the witch trials, and Mather addressed the crowd with the practiced eloquence of a man accustomed to commanding attention, and he reminded them that the devil was the great deceiver, that Satan could grant his servants the ability to recite even sacred words if it served his purposes, that the recitation of the Lord's Prayer proved nothing except the depth of the devil's cunning. And the crowd listened, and the doubt that had been building like pressure behind a dam began to recede, began to dissipate under the weight of Mather's authority, and the execution proceeded, and George Burroughs died, and this moment illuminates with terrible clarity the power of a single authority figure to override the collective moral intuition of a crowd, because the people gathered on Gallows Hill that day were not stupid, they were not incapable of recognizing what was happening before their eyes. They had seen a condemned man perform the very act that was supposed to be impossible for someone in his position, and their instinctive response was correct. Their doubt was warranted, their tears were appropriate, but all of that natural moral reasoning was swept aside by the intervention of one man whose social position gave his words more weight than the evidence of their own senses. And this is a pattern that recurs throughout human history. This capacity for authority to silence perception, for status to overrule evidence, for the confident voice of power to drown out the quiet voice of conscience. And then in September came the case that still haunts the imagination more than 3 centuries later, the case of Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer, husband of Martha Corey, who had herself been accused and would eventually be hanged. And Giles Corey's story is unlike any other in the Salem narrative, because he made a choice that set him apart from every other defendant. He refused to enter a plea, he stood before the court and would not say guilty, and would not say not guilty. He simply refused to participate in the proceedings at all, and under English common law, this refusal triggered an ancient and horrifying penalty known as peine forte et dure, strong and harsh punishment, which meant that the defendant would be stripped and laid upon the ground, and a heavy board would be placed upon his chest, and stones would be piled upon the board, one by one, more and more weight pressing down, until the defendant either agreed to enter a plea or was crushed to death. And this is exactly what was done to Giles Corey on the 19th of September, in an open field near the jail, and the pressing lasted 2 days. 2 days during which the weight on his chest was gradually increased. 2 days during which his ribs cracked, and his breathing became a shallow, rattling labour. 2 days during which the sheriff periodically asked him how he would plead, and Giles Corey's response, the only words he has recorded as having spoken during those 2 days of agony, were more weight, more weight. 2 words that carry across the centuries like a thunderclap. 2 words that contain within them an entire philosophy of resistance. Because Corey understood something that most of the other defendants did not or could not act upon. He understood that the legal system had been so thoroughly corrupted that participation in it was itself a form of complicity, that to enter a plea was to grant legitimacy to a court that deserved none, and he understood something else as well, something more personal and more practical, that under the laws of the time, if he were tried and convicted, his property could be seized by the government, his estate confiscated, his children and grandchildren left with nothing. But if he died without entering a plea, if he simply endured until his body gave out, the conviction could never be formalized and his property would pass to his heirs as intended. And so his refusal was simultaneously an act of principled defiance and an act of love, a father and grandfather using the only power left to him, the power to withstand suffering, to protect the people he would leave behind. And the psychology of what Giles Corey did is extraordinary, because it represents the far end of a spectrum that most people never approach, the spectrum of moral courage under extreme physical duress. And the question that his example raises is one that every human being would prefer never to face, which is, what would you do? What would any of us do? When the cost of resistance is not social disapproval or professional setback, but the literal crushing of your body under stones, and the fact that Corey endured it, that he did not break, that his last recorded words were not a plea for mercy, but a demand for more weight, suggests that somewhere in the architecture of the human spirit there exists a capacity for defiance that cannot be destroyed by any amount of physical force, a capacity that the torturers and the judges and the executioners, for all their power, could not reach or extinguish. And as the summer ground on and the executions accumulated, it is worth pausing to examine the psychological forces that kept this machinery running, the invisible architecture of belief and behaviour that allowed an entire community to participate in, or at least tolerate, the systematic murder of its own members, because from a distance of 3 centuries it can seem incomprehensible. It can seem like a kind of madness that we in our modern sophistication could never replicate. But this is a dangerous illusion, because the psychological mechanisms at work in Salem are not exotic or archaic. They are the same mechanisms that operate in every human group, in every era, in every culture. And the first of these is a phenomenon that psychologists call de-individuation, the process by which individuals who are absorbed into a group begin to lose their sense of personal identity and personal responsibility, begin to think and feel and act not as separate moral agents, but as undifferentiated members of a collective. And in Salem, this de-individuation was powerfully reinforced by the religious framework that governed every aspect of life, because the Puritans understood themselves not as a collection of individuals, but as a covenanted community, a people bound together by a sacred agreement with God, and this meant that the threat of witchcraft was not a threat to any one person, but a threat to the community as a whole, a threat to the covenant itself, and responding to that threat was therefore not an individual choice, but a collective obligation. And within this framework, the normal moral inhibitions that might have restrained individual behaviour were gradually dissolved, because the individual was no longer acting as an individual, but as an instrument of the community's will. And closely related to this de-individuation was the phenomenon of groupthink, the tendency of cohesive groups to converge on a single interpretation of events and to suppress any dissenting viewpoints. And in Salem the groupthink was nearly total, reinforced by the authority of the ministers, the magistrates, the judges, and the governor himself, all of whom had endorsed the reality of the witchcraft crisis and the legitimacy of the court's proceedings. And within this environment of consensus, anyone who harboured doubts faced an almost impossible calculus, because to express doubt was not merely to disagree with a policy or a procedure, but to set oneself against the entire moral and spiritual framework of the community. And worse, to risk being accused oneself for the logic of the witch hunt contained within it, a terrifyingly effective mechanism of self-protection. If you questioned the trials, you were sympathising with the witches, and if you sympathised with the witches, you were perhaps a witch yourself. And this circular logic created a zone of silence around the proceedings that was almost impossible to penetrate. And then there was what psychologists call moral disengagement, the process by which people restructure their understanding of their own actions so that the normal moral rules seem not to apply. And in Salem, the primary mechanism of moral disengagement was theological. The accused were not merely criminals or deviants, but agents of Satan, servants of the ultimate enemy of God and humanity. And once a person was categorized in this way, the normal moral obligations that governed how one treated one's neighbors, obligations of charity, of compassion, of the presumption of innocence, simply evaporated, because these obligations applied to human beings, and the servants of Satan had forfeited their humanity, had placed themselves outside the circle of moral concern. And this is a pattern that recurs with sickening regularity in human history. This capacity to redefine the victims of persecution as something less than human, something other than human, something that does not deserve the protections that humanness confers, and alongside this moral disengagement operated what modern psychologists call the just world hypothesis, the deep-seated human need to believe that the world is fundamentally fair, that people get what they deserve and deserve what they get, and this belief, which serves an important psychological function by making the world feel predictable and controllable, became in the context of Salem a powerful engine of victim blaming. Because if someone was accused of witchcraft, if the court found them guilty, if they were led to the gallows and hanged, then they must have done something to deserve it. Because the alternative, that the innocent could be destroyed by a system that was supposed to protect them, was too terrifying to contemplate. And finally there was the sunk cost fallacy, the psychological tendency to continue investing in a losing course of action because of the resources already spent. And by September of 1692, the community of Salem had invested enormously in the witch trials, not just in money and time, but in moral capital, in lives. They had executed 14 people by hanging and crushed one more to death. And to admit that these executions had been unjust would be to admit that the community had committed murder, not once but repeatedly, deliberately, systematically. And this was a conclusion that the human mind recoils from with every fibre of its being. And so the trials continued, and each new execution made it harder to stop because each new death added to the moral debt that would come due if the community ever admitted its error. And yet not everyone was silent. Not everyone was swept along by the current of collective madness, and it is important, deeply important, to acknowledge those who resisted, because their existence proves that the psychological forces at work in Salem, powerful as they were not irresistible, that human beings retain the capacity to think and judge and act according to their own conscience, even in the most oppressive circumstances. And among those who resisted were people like the Reverend Francis Dane of Andover, who publicly questioned the proceedings and offered shelter to some of the accused, and people like Thomas Brattle, a Boston merchant and mathematician who wrote a detailed and devastating critique of the trials in a letter that circulated among the colonial elite, and people like the jurors who initially acquitted Rebecca Nurse, who for one brief shining moment placed their own moral judgment above the demands of the crowd, even though they were ultimately pressured into reversing themselves. And the question of why some people resist while others comply is one of the most important questions in all of psychology, and the answer is complex and multifaceted. But one element that seems to recur in studies of moral courage is a strong sense of individual identity that is not entirely dependent on group membership, a capacity to locate the source of moral authority within oneself, rather than in the consensus of the community. And another element is simple proximity. The people who were most likely to resist were often those who had personal relationships with the accused, who knew them as individuals rather than as abstractions, because it is much harder to condemn a person you know, a person you have shared meals with and borrowed tools from and watched grow old, than it is to condemn a category, a label, an abstraction called witch. And yet for every person who resisted there were dozens who remained silent, who watched the executions and said nothing, who harboured private doubts but never gave them voice. And this silence was not mere cowardice, or rather it was not only cowardice, it was also the product of the bystander effect, the well-documented tendency of individuals in groups to assume that someone else will take action, that the responsibility for intervening is diffused across the entire group, so that no single person feels compelled to act. And in Salem, this diffusion of responsibility was compounded by the very real danger of speaking out, because the witch hunt had demonstrated again and again that accusation could fall on anyone, that neither wealth nor piety nor social standing provided reliable protection. And so the calculation that most people made, consciously or unconsciously, was that the risk of speaking out far outweighed the likelihood that their individual voice would make any difference. And this calculation, repeated hundreds of times across the community, produced a silence that was itself a form of consent, a silence that the court could interpret as approval, a silence that allowed the killing to continue. But the very mechanism that had powered the witch hunt, the escalating spiral of accusation and fear, contained within it the seeds of its own destruction, because accusation, like fire, does not respect boundaries, does not discriminate between appropriate and inappropriate targets, and as the summer of 1692 gave way to the first cool evenings of September, the afflicted girls, emboldened by months of deference and attention, began to reach higher, began to name people whose social position should have placed them beyond the reach of accusation, and among those they accused was Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps himself, the very man who had established the court of Oyer and Terminer and given it its authority. And they also accused Samuel Willard, one of the most prominent ministers in Boston and the acting president of Harvard College. And these accusations were like a bucket of cold water thrown on a fevered sleeper, because they revealed with sudden clarity the indiscriminate nature of the proceedings, the fact that the accusatory machinery had no internal governor, no mechanism for distinguishing between legitimate targets and illegitimate ones, and if the governor's own wife could be accused, then no one was safe. Literally, no one. And the people who had supported the trials because they believed that the accusations were targeting genuine threats to the community were suddenly forced to confront the possibility that the accusations were targeting everyone, that the circle of suspicion had expanded to the point where it encompassed the entire social order, and this realization, spreading through the colony like a crack through ice, began to erode the foundation of support that had sustained the trials for months. And around this same time, Increase Mather, Cotton Mather's father and one of the most respected intellectual figures in New England, published a work titled Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, in which he argued carefully and methodically against the use of spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted that they had seen the spectre of the accused tormenting them, evidence that had been the cornerstone of virtually every conviction the court had handed down, and Increase Mather wrote a line that would become one of the most quoted sentences in the history of American jurisprudence. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. And this was not some radical outsider speaking. This was the president of Harvard, the father of the court's most prominent intellectual defender, and his words carried enormous weight, and they gave permission to the doubters and the skeptics and the privately horrified to begin speaking their doubts aloud, because now they could point to an authority figure, a figure of unimpeachable orthodoxy, who shared their concerns. And in the town of Andover, which had become a secondary epicenter of accusations, something even more remarkable happened. Some of the accusers themselves began to recant, began to withdraw their testimony, and the trigger for this reversal was surprisingly mundane. It was a lawsuit, a defamation suit filed by one of the accused against his accusers, and the mere threat of legal consequences, of being held personally accountable for the accusations they had made, was enough to cause several of the Andover accusers to admit that they had lied, that they had been pressured into making accusations, that they had named people as witches not because they had any evidence but because they were expected to, because the momentum of the proceedings demanded it, because everyone else was doing it, and these recantations sent shockwaves through the colony, because they confirmed what many had suspected but few had dared to say, that at least some of the testimony that had sent people to the gallows was false, was fabricated, was the product of social pressure and mass hysteria, rather than genuine spiritual affliction. And the psychology of this tipping point is itself deeply instructive because it demonstrates that mass delusions do not collapse gradually. They do not fade away in a slow, even decline. Instead, they tend to persist at full intensity until a critical threshold is reached. A threshold at which the social cost of maintaining the delusion begins to exceed the social cost of abandoning it. And once that threshold is crossed, the collapse can be remarkably swift. because all the doubt and discomfort and moral unease that had been accumulating silently for months is suddenly released at once, and people who yesterday would never have dared to question the proceedings find themselves today wondering how they ever believed in them. And this is what began to happen in the autumn of 1692. As the accusations overreached and the intellectual foundations crumbled and the accusers themselves began to waver, the spell that had held the colony in its grip for 6 terrible months began to break. Not with a dramatic moment of revelation, but with a gradual dawning, a slow, terrible awakening, like a dreamer becoming aware, layer by layer, that the nightmare they have been living through was of their own creation. But before the spell broke completely, there was one more day of killing, one final convulsion of the machinery of death, and that was the 22nd of September, 1692, when 8 people were hanged on Gallows Hill in what would be the last mass execution of the Salem witch trials. 8 people, Martha Corey among them, the wife of Giles Corey who had been pressed to death just 3 days earlier, and Mary Easty, the sister of Rebecca Nurse who had been hanged in June. And imagine for a moment the Easty family. Imagine what it was to live through those months, to lose first one sister and then another to the same relentless machinery. And Mary Easty had written a petition from prison that stands as one of the most moving documents in American history, a petition in which she did not beg for her own life, but asked only that the court examine its methods more carefully so that no more innocent blood would be shed, and her words were calm and measured and heartbreakingly dignified, the words of a woman who had accepted her own death, but could not accept the principle that had condemned her, and she was hanged alongside 7 others on that September morning, and the crowd that watched was quieter now than it had been in June. The fervour had drained away, and what remained was something more complicated and more uncomfortable, something that might have been the first stirring of shame, and after that day there would be no more hangings, no more pressings, no more deaths, because in October Governor Phipps, whose own wife had been touched by the accusations, dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, the special tribunal that had presided over the entire bloody summer, and he forbade any further arrests for witchcraft, and the remaining prisoners, more than 100 men and women still languishing in the jails, would eventually be released, some of them not until the following spring. And the trials were over, the killing was done, but the reckoning was only beginning. Because a community that has done what Salem did does not simply return to normal, does not simply close the door on the summer of 1692 and resume its life as if nothing happened. The dead were still dead, the families were still shattered, the neighbours who had accused each other still lived side by side on the same narrow lanes, and the questions that the trials had raised, questions about the reliability of testimony and the nature of evidence and the relationship between spiritual authority and civil power, and the terrible capacity of ordinary people to do extraordinary harm when the conditions are right, those questions did not go away when the court was dissolved. They hung in the air like the memory of smoke, and they hang there still, drifting across the centuries, settling into every generation that pauses long enough to listen, to wonder, to ask how such a thing could happen and whether it could happen again, and the answer to that second question, the one that matters most, the one that should keep us awake but instead sends us into an uneasy sleep, is that it has happened again and again and again, in different forms and different places and under different names, because the psychological architecture that made Salem possible is not a relic of the 17th century, but a permanent feature of the human mind, woven into the very fabric of our social nature, into our need to belong and our fear of exclusion, and our willingness to believe what the group believes, and our capacity to look away from suffering when looking toward it, would cost us too much. And so as you settle deeper into the stillness of this night, as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to soften and blur at the edges, carry with you the faces of those who died on Gallows Hill, and in that open field where the stones pressed down. Carry with you the quiet courage of Giles Corey, and the devastating dignity of Mary Easty, and the terrible last words of Sarah Good. Carry with you the knowledge that the line between the accusers and the accused, between the righteous and the condemned, between those who go along and those who stand apart, that line is thinner and more fragile than we would like to believe, and it runs not between communities or nations or centuries, but through the centre of every human heart, and in the silence that follows, in the deep and gathering dark, let that knowledge settle into you like snow falling on still water, not as a burden, but as a kind of vigilance, a quiet and abiding awareness that the price of our humanity is eternal attention to the ways in which we are capable of losing it. By the middle of October 1692, the machinery of death had finally ground to a halt. Not because the people of Massachusetts had suddenly discovered their conscience, not because some great moral awakening had swept through the colony like a cleansing wind, but because the accusations had climbed too high, reached too far, touched the lives of people too powerful and too protected to be dragged into a Salem jail cell, and so the entire apparatus of persecution simply became untenable, politically dangerous, an embarrassment that threatened to consume the very men who had set it in motion. Governor William Phips, who had established the court of Oyer and Terminer with such confidence back in May, who had handed the gavel to William Stoughton and then conveniently sailed north to deal with conflicts on the frontier, returned to find his colony in shambles, his courts drenched in blood, and his own wife's name whispered among the accused. And in that moment the calculus shifted, the way it always shifts when power feels the teeth of its own creation closing around its ankle. Phips dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer in late October, shutting down the judicial body that had sent 20 people to their deaths, with an efficiency that should have horrified everyone who witnessed it. And yet even in this act of dissolution there was no admission of error, no acknowledgement that innocent blood had been spilled, only a quiet bureaucratic manoeuvre, a restructuring, as though the problem had been one of procedure rather than of profound moral failure. The jails remained full. The accused still languished in their chains, shivering through the approaching New England winter, in cells that were dark and cold and stinking, paying for their own imprisonment, because that was how the system worked. Even the innocent were charged for the privilege of being held captive, and some of them had been there for months, their families bankrupted, their farms untended, their livestock wandering, their children scattered among reluctant neighbours. In January of 1693, the Superior Court of Judicature convened under the same William Stoughton, who had presided over the previous court with such merciless zeal. But this time the rules had changed in one crucial respect. The new court would not allow spectral evidence, that poisonous doctrine that had permitted accusers to claim they saw the ghostly shape of the accused tormenting them in visions no one else could verify. And without spectral evidence, the entire edifice of accusation simply collapsed, like a building whose foundation has been quietly removed. Nearly all of the remaining accused were acquitted. Case after case came before the court and was dismissed for lack of evidence. Because there had never been any real evidence, only the writhing bodies and shrieking voices of the afflicted girls, only the terrified confessions of people who had been told that admitting to witchcraft was the only way to save their own lives. And now, without the spectre of spectral testimony, the judges looked at what remained and found nothing, nothing at all, just frightened people in chains and a community that had torn itself apart over shadows. Stoughton was furious. He had wanted to continue the executions, had signed death warrants for several of the accused even after the new court was established, and when Phips reprieved those condemned prisoners, Stoughton stormed off the bench in a rage, declaring that the governor had obstructed the course of justice, apparently unable or unwilling to see that what had been practiced in Salem bore no resemblance to justice whatsoever. By May of 1693, Phips ordered the release of all remaining prisoners, issuing pardons that emptied the jails at last, though the word pardon itself carried a bitter irony, because a pardon implies guilt, implies that mercy is being extended to someone who has done wrong, and these people had done nothing, had committed no crime, had simply been caught in the gravitational pull of a community's collective madness. But the damage was already woven into the fabric of the colony's history, impossible to undo, impossible to unstitch. 20 people had been executed, 19 of them had been led to Proctor's Ledge and hanged by the neck until they were dead, their bodies cut down and shoved into shallow crevices in the rock, because they were denied proper Christian burial, because in death, as in their final days of life, they were treated as less than human, as vessels of evil undeserving of dignity. And then there was Giles Corey, 81 years old, who had refused to enter a plea and was subjected to peine forte et dure, the ancient punishment of pressing heavy stones laid upon his chest one by one over the course of 2 agonizing days, while the authorities demanded that he submit to the court's jurisdiction. And Corey, with a stubbornness that borders on the sublime, refused, and his last words, according to tradition, were more weight, a defiance so absolute and so costly that it has echoed through the centuries as a testament to the irreducible core of human resistance. At least 5 more people died in jail, their bodies broken by the cold and the filth and the despair of imprisonment, and over 200 people had been formally accused. Their names entered into the record of suspicion, a stain that would follow their families for generations. The economic devastation was immense. Farms had been abandoned, businesses destroyed, property seized. The families that had lived as neighbours for decades now regarded each other with suspicion and bitterness, the accusers and the families of the accused locked in a mutual contempt that would outlast the lifetimes of everyone involved. Salem village itself would never recover its former identity, eventually renaming itself Danvers, as though a change of name could wash away the memory of what had happened there. And perhaps in some small way it did, because names carry power, and to shed a name is to attempt a kind of forgetting, however incomplete. The reckoning when it came was slow and insufficient, the way reckonings almost always are. It was not until January of 1697, nearly 5 years after the first accusations, that the Massachusetts General Court declared an official day of fasting and repentance, a collective acknowledgement that something had gone terribly wrong, though even this gesture was carefully worded, attributing the tragedy to the delusions of Satan rather than to the failures of human judgment, as though the devil himself had been the true architect of the trials and the people of Massachusetts merely his unwitting instruments. But there was one moment of genuine moral courage in the midst of all this carefully hedged regret, and it came from an unlikely source. Judge Samuel Sewell, one of the 9 magistrates who had sat on the court of Oyer and Terminer, who had listened to the testimony and signed the death warrants and watched the executions proceed without objection, stood in his pew at the Old South Church in Boston on that day of fasting, and handed a written confession to his minister, who read it aloud to the congregation while Sewell remained standing, his head bowed, accepting full responsibility for his role in the bloodshed. He asked forgiveness from God and from the people of the colony, acknowledging that he had been wrong, that innocent people had died because of decisions he had made, and he asked that the guilt and the shame of it be placed upon him alone and not upon his family or his descendants. It was an extraordinary act. In a culture that prized certainty and authority, in a society where admitting error was tantamount to admitting weakness, Sewell chose to stand before his community and say plainly that he had participated in a monstrous injustice. He would observe that day of fasting every year for the rest of his life, a private penance repeated annually until his death, and while his confession did not bring back the dead or heal the wounds his court had inflicted, it stands as one of the rare moments in history when a person in power looked honestly at what they had done and did not turn away. The same cannot be said of most of the others involved. The other judges remained silent. The ministers who had encouraged the proceedings offered no apologies. Cotton Mather, who had written so approvingly of the trials, spent the rest of his life defending his involvement, insisting that the court had acted properly, that the danger of witchcraft had been real, that the executions had been justified. And then there was Ann Putnam Jr., who as a 12-year-old girl had been one of the most prolific accusers, whose testimony had helped send numerous people to the gallows, and who in 1706, 14 years after the trials, stood in the Salem village meeting house while a confession was read on her behalf, because she was too distraught to read it herself, in which she claimed that she had been deluded by Satan, that she had acted not out of malice but out of ignorance and spiritual deception, and she asked forgiveness from the families of those she had helped to condemn. It was a strange and somewhat unsatisfying document, this confession, because it placed the blame on the devil rather than on the very human dynamics of jealousy and attention and power that had driven the accusations, and because Ann Putnam was by then a broken woman, orphaned, unmarried, caring for younger siblings, her life narrowed and diminished in ways that suggest her role in the trials had exacted its own terrible price. But no one was truly held accountable. No judge was removed from the bench. No minister was defrocked. No accuser faced criminal charges. The machinery of persecution simply stopped, and the community slowly, painfully, awkwardly attempted to resume the business of living alongside people it had tried to destroy. And so we are left with the question that has haunted historians and psychologists and philosophers for over 3 centuries. What actually happened in Salem? What turned a small farming community in colonial Massachusetts into a theatre of accusation and execution? What made seemingly rational people believe that their neighbours were servants of the devil, that invisible spectres were tormenting children, that the only remedy for this invisible threat was the very visible violence of the gallows? The answers are multiple, overlapping, and none of them alone is sufficient. In 1976, a researcher named Linda Caparel proposed that the initial symptoms of the afflicted girls might have been caused by ergot poisoning, ergot being a fungus that grows on rye grain in warm, damp conditions and produces alkaloids chemically related to lysergic acid, the precursor to LSD. Ergotism can cause convulsions, muscle spasms, hallucinations, a crawling sensation on the skin, and other symptoms that bear a striking resemblance to the behaviours described in the Salem records. The theory was elegant and appealing, offering a neat biological explanation for what had seemed like an inexplicable outbreak of madness, and the conditions in Salem village were right. The rye crop of 1691 had been grown in the low, wet fields on the western side of the village, exactly the kind of environment where ergot thrives. But the theory has been widely critiqued and largely set aside by most historians. The pattern of affliction did not match the expected pattern of ergot poisoning, which would have affected anyone who ate the contaminated grain, not just a specific group of young girls. The symptoms appeared and disappeared in ways that correlated with social events rather than with dietary exposure. And ergot poisoning does not explain the core phenomenon of the trials, which was not the physical symptoms themselves but the elaborate, detailed, socially specific accusations that the afflicted girls made, accusations that targeted particular individuals for particular reasons, and that shifted and evolved in response to the social dynamics of the courtroom. Other researchers have pointed to mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, a well-documented phenomenon in which physical symptoms spread through a group of people with no identifiable organic cause, driven by anxiety, suggestion, and the powerful human tendency to unconsciously mimic the behaviours of those around us. The girls of Salem were young, they were under enormous psychological stress. They lived in a culture saturated with fear of the devil and belief in the reality of witchcraft, and when the first girl began to exhibit strange symptoms, the others followed, their bodies producing real physical sensations in response to the overwhelming power of belief and expectation. Conversion disorder, the modern clinical term for what was once called hysteria, describes a condition in which psychological distress is converted into physical symptoms: paralysis, blindness, seizures, tremors, symptoms that are entirely real to the person experiencing them but that have no neurological basis, and it is possible, even likely, that some of the afflicted girls were genuinely experiencing something, that their bodies were expressing a distress their conscious minds could not articulate, that the contortions and screaming fits were not entirely performed, but were the physical manifestation of psychic anguish, finding its only available outlet. Sleep paralysis may have played a role as well, that terrifying state between waking and sleeping in which the body is immobilized but the mind is conscious, often accompanied by vivid hallucinations of dark figures pressing on the chest, sitting on the bed, hovering in the room, a phenomenon that has been interpreted across cultures and centuries as demonic visitation, and that would have been understood by the Puritans as exactly the kind of spectral assault they feared most. And then there is social contagion, the simple but profound observation that beliefs and behaviours spread through communities the way diseases do, passing from person to person through networks of contact and communication, amplified by repetition and reinforced by the responses of authority figures. And in Salem, the contagion spread with devastating speed because every institution that might have served as a check on the madness instead became an accelerant, the church validating the accusations, the courts giving them legal force, the government providing the mechanism of execution. But the most convincing explanation, the one that encompasses all the others and places them in their proper context, is that Salem was a perfect storm, a convergence of forces that individually might have been manageable, but together created a catastrophe. There was genuine belief in witchcraft, a belief shared by virtually every person in the colony from the humblest farmer to the most educated minister, a belief rooted in theology and scripture and centuries of European tradition, a belief that made the accusations not absurd but terrifyingly plausible. There was social tension, the long-simmering conflict between Salem village and Salem town, between the agrarian traditionalists and the mercantile modernizers, between families competing for land and influence and status in a community too small to absorb their ambitions. There was institutional failure, a court system that adopted rules of evidence so permissive that accusation became indistinguishable from proof, that allowed spectral evidence to stand as testimony, that created a perverse incentive structure in which confessing to witchcraft saved your life, while maintaining your innocence condemned you to death. There was individual grievance, the personal grudges and property disputes and old resentments that found their expression in accusations of witchcraft. The neighbour you had quarrelled with over a boundary line, the woman who had spoken too sharply to you in the meeting house, the family whose prosperity you envied or whose poverty you disdained. There was confirmation bias, the universal human tendency to seek out and interpret information in ways that confirm what you already believe, so that once you believed your neighbour was a witch, everything she did became evidence of her guilt. Her kindness was manipulation, her anger was malice, her silence was concealment, and her protests of innocence were the most damning evidence of all, because of course a witch would deny being a witch. And there was groupthink, the phenomenon by which a group of people, driven by the desire for conformity and the fear of dissent, converge on a shared belief that no individual member would have arrived at alone, each person's conviction reinforcing every other person's conviction until the belief becomes self-sustaining, impervious to evidence, resistant to reason, a closed loop of mutual reinforcement that can only be broken by an external shock powerful enough to shatter the consensus. Social identity theory offers another lens through which to understand Salem, the theory that our sense of who we are is deeply bound up with the groups to which we belong, and that when a group feels threatened, its members instinctively close ranks, drawing sharper boundaries between the in-group and the out-group, between us and them, between the godly and the damned. Salem in 1692 was a community under threat from every direction: the frontier war with the Wabanaki and their French allies, the political uncertainty following the collapse of the old colonial charter, the economic disruption of a changing economy, the spiritual anxiety of a people who believed they were losing their covenant with God. And in this atmosphere of pervasive fear, the community turned on itself, identifying the threat not in the external forces that were actually destabilizing their world, but in the familiar faces of their own neighbors, because the enemy within is always more frightening than the enemy without, and because the human need to locate and name the source of one's suffering is so powerful that it will manufacture a target if none presents itself. And who were the targets? Disproportionately, they were women. Women who did not conform to the narrow expectations of Puritan femininity. Women who were outspoken, who argued with their neighbours, who did not defer to male authority with sufficient meekness. Women who owned property or stood to inherit it, whose economic independence made them anomalies in a patriarchal order. Women who were sexually suspect, who had borne children outside marriage, who had been rumoured to have engaged in improper relationships. Women who were socially marginal, who lived alone, who were old, who were poor, who begged for food or charity and made their neighbours uncomfortable with the visible evidence of their need. The trials functioned, whether consciously or not, as a mechanism of social control, a spectacular demonstration of what happened to those who deviated from the community's norms, who occupied social positions that made them vulnerable, who lacked the networks of protection and patronage that might have shielded them from accusation. The terror of Salem was not just in the executions themselves, but in the message they sent to every woman, every person, who might have been tempted to step outside the boundaries of acceptable behaviour, the message that nonconformity could be lethal, that the community had the power and the will to destroy anyone who threatened its sense of order, and that the instruments of that destruction were cloaked in the language of divine justice, making resistance not just dangerous but sinful. And this is perhaps the most disturbing lesson of Salem, not that it happened, but that it keeps happening, the same pattern repeating across centuries and cultures with a regularity that suggests it is not an aberration but a feature of human social organisation, a recurring failure mode built into the architecture of communities and institutions and belief systems. In the 1950s, Arthur Miller sat in a library reading the transcripts of the Salem trials and recognised in them the contours of his own time, the Red Scare, the House Un-American Activities Committee, Senator Joseph McCarthy standing before the cameras and waving his list of names of alleged communists who had infiltrated the government, the military, the entertainment industry, names that carried the same weight of accusation that the word witch had carried in Salem, and Miller wrote The Crucible, a play set in 1692. Salem that was transparently about 1950s America, because the parallels were so exact, so undeniable, that to dramatize one was to illuminate the other. The same fear, the same accusations based on flimsy evidence, the same destruction of lives and careers, the same cowardice of those who went along to protect themselves, the same courage of those few who refused. In the 1980s, another wave of accusations swept across America, the Satanic Panic, a period of widespread belief that satanic cults were operating daycare centers where children were subjected to ritual abuse. And the cases that emerged, the McMartin preschool case in California, the Fells Acres case in Massachusetts, dozens of others across the country, bore a resemblance to Salem that was almost uncanny. Children encouraged by anxious adults to produce ever more elaborate and fantastical accusations. Accusations that involved secret tunnels and animal sacrifice and flights through the air. Accusations that should have strained credulity, but instead were taken seriously by prosecutors and juries and judges because the fear was real, the belief was genuine, and the institutional mechanisms that should have served as safeguards instead amplified the hysteria, just as they had in Salem 3 centuries earlier. Lives were destroyed. People were convicted and imprisoned for crimes that never happened, spending years and even decades behind bars before the convictions were overturned, and the children who had been coached to make the accusations grew up, carrying the weight of testimony they had been too young to understand, and the parents who had believed their children were in danger spent years consumed by a fear that had no basis in reality. And the whole terrible episode eventually faded from public consciousness, filed away as an embarrassment, a collective lapse in judgment, something that could not happen again until it did. Because the pattern always repeats. The moral panics over heavy metal music and Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s, the fears about violent video games corrupting the youth in the 90s and 2000s, the waves of Islamophobia that followed the attacks of September 11th, 2001, when an entire religion of over 1 billion people was treated as suspect because of the actions of a tiny number of extremists, and neighbours turned on neighbours, and people who had lived peacefully in their communities for decades were suddenly regarded with suspicion and hostility, and the language of the persecution was always the same. Always fear dressed up as vigilance, always hatred disguised as protection, always the identification of a vulnerable other onto whom the community's anxieties could be projected, and through whose punishment those anxieties could be temporarily relieved. The formula is always the same: fear plus uncertainty plus an identifiable other, plus the endorsement of institutional authority equals mass delusion. It is a recipe as reliable as any in chemistry, and it produces the same result every time, and the only variable is the identity of the accused, which changes with the culture and the century, but whose essential characteristic remains constant. They are the people a community has decided it can afford to sacrifice, the people whose destruction will cost the powerful nothing and will purchase for the majority a momentary sense of safety and coherence and righteous purpose. Modern Salem knows this. The town that was once the site of one of America's most shameful episodes of injustice has transformed itself into a destination, a brand, a year-round celebration of its own dark history. The streets are lined with witch-themed shops and museums. The witch trial memorial stands in a quiet corner near the old bearing point, and every October the town fills with tourists who come to consume the aesthetics of the macabre, to buy witch hats and broomstick keychains, and to take selfies in front of the sites where real people suffered and died. There is an irony here that is difficult to sit with, the irony of a tourist economy built on mass injustice, of souvenirs manufactured from suffering, of a community that profits from the very history it once tried so desperately to forget. But the memorial itself resists this commodification. Dedicated in 1992, 300 years after the trials, it is a simple and devastating work of design. A series of stone benches set into a low wall, each bench inscribed with the name of one of the 20 people who were executed, along with the date and method of their death. And carved into the threshold stones are the words the accused spoke in their own defence, their protests of innocence, their pleas for mercy, their final declarations of faith, and the words are deliberately cut off, interrupted mid-sentence, the stone slabs extending beyond the wall as though reaching for a completion that will never come. And this incompleteness is the memorial's most powerful statement because it represents lives cut short, voices silenced, sentences left forever unfinished, and there is nothing you can buy in any gift shop that captures the meaning of that unfinished stone. And now, as the telling of this story draws toward its close, let us return one last time to the landscape where it all began, to the place that was once Salem Village and is now the quiet town of Danvers, Massachusetts, where the fields that the Puritans cleared from the forest have long since been subdivided and developed, where the meeting house where the examinations took place is gone, its exact location marked by a modest monument that most passers-by walk past without noticing, where the parsonage where Samuel Parris lived with his family and his enslaved woman Tituba has vanished, replaced by the ordinary architecture of an ordinary New England town, and where the forest that pressed in on every side, the vast and terrible wilderness that the Puritans believed was Satan's domain, has been reduced to scattered woodlots and conservation areas where people walk their dogs on weekend mornings, the trees casting dappled shadows on well-maintained trails, the undergrowth thinned and managed. The darkness that once seemed so absolute now penetrated by sunlight and birdsong and the distant sound of traffic on Route 1. The voices of the accused have faded. Sarah Good, who cursed the Reverend Noyes from the scaffold. Rebecca Nurse, who maintained her innocence with a quiet dignity that even her executioners could not diminish. John Proctor, who fought the charges with every legal tool available to him and lost. Martha Corey, who laughed at the absurdity of the accusations and was hanged for her defiance. Giles Corey, who chose to be crushed rather than submit. Bridget Bishop, the first to die, whose colourful clothing and sharp tongue had made her a target long before the afflicted girls ever spoke her name. George Burroughs, the minister who recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly on the scaffold, a feat that was supposed to be impossible for a witch, and was hanged anyway because Cotton Mather rode forward on his horse and told the crowd that the devil could appear as an angel of light. Their voices are gone now, absorbed into the soil and the stone and the slow patient work of centuries. But what they said, what they endured, what was done to them in the name of God and justice and the protection of the community remains, not as a wound that still bleeds, but as a scar that the landscape carries, a reminder written into the very ground that beneath the surface of any ordered society there lies the potential for extraordinary cruelty, and that this potential is activated not by monsters but by ordinary people. People who believe they are doing right. People who are afraid. People who cannot tolerate uncertainty and so manufacture certainty out of accusation and violence. And what Salem teaches us, if we are willing to learn, is something uncomfortable about the nature of justice, which is that justice is not a permanent condition, but a practice, a discipline, a thing that must be maintained through constant effort and constant vigilance, not vigilance against witches or communists or Satanists or any other imagined enemy, but vigilance against our own worst impulses, against the seductive comfort of certainty, against the human craving for simple explanations for complex suffering, against the willingness to sacrifice the vulnerable for the psychological comfort of the majority. Justice fails not when evil people corrupt it, but when good people stop questioning it, when the mechanisms of fairness are allowed to operate on autopilot, when the institutions charged with protecting the innocent become so convinced of their own righteousness that they can no longer hear the protests of those they are destroying. And this is the fragility that Salem reveals, not the fragility of a particular community in a particular century, but the fragility that lives inside every community, every institution, every human heart that has ever been tempted to believe that its fear justifies its cruelty. The power of belief is immense. It can build cathedrals and hospitals and schools. It can inspire acts of extraordinary compassion and sacrifice. But it can also build scaffolds and fill jails and drive an 81-year-old man into the ground under a pile of stones. And the difference between these outcomes is not the presence or absence of belief itself, but the willingness to hold belief accountable to evidence, to reason, to the irreducible dignity of the individual human being who stands before you and says, "I am innocent, I am innocent, I am innocent," and is not believed. The danger of certainty is that it closes the door to doubt, and doubt, uncomfortable as it is the only thing that stands between a community and its own capacity for destruction. The people of Salem were not more evil than you or I. They were not less intelligent, not less moral, not less capable of compassion. They were people living in a world that frightened them, a world full of threats they could not control and could barely understand, and they reached for the tools their culture gave them: the theology, the legal system, the social structure, and those tools, designed to protect and preserve, became instruments of annihilation, because the people wielding them had stopped asking whether they might be wrong. And now the night is settling over New England, the way it has settled every evening for the past 334 years since the trials ended, the same slow darkening of the sky, the same emergence of stars above the bare branches of the old oaks and elms that line the streets of Danvers, the same gradual quieting of the world as the birds fall silent and the wind drops and the last light drains from the western horizon like water from a shallow bowl. The houses glow with their warm interior lights, families moving behind curtained windows, and the streets empty, and the parks darken, and the old burying grounds where some of the judges and accusers and accused all lie together in the same consecrated earth settle into their nightly stillness, the gravestones tilting at angles that centuries of frost heave have imposed upon them, the carved death's heads and winged skulls and weeping willows slowly disappearing as the darkness deepens and the stone becomes indistinguishable from the shadow. Somewhere a dog barks once and is quiet. Somewhere a door closes softly. Somewhere the last car of the evening passes down a street that was once a cart path through the village, its headlights sweeping briefly across the facade of a church that stands on ground where the meeting house once stood, and then the headlights pass, and the darkness returns, and the silence deepens, and the town is alone with its history, alone with the memory of what it did and what was done in its name. A memory that grows quieter with each passing year, each passing decade, each passing century, but that never quite disappears because some things are too important to forget entirely, even when forgetting would be easier, even when forgetting would be kinder, even when the weight of remembering is a burden that no single community should have to carry alone. The fields are dark now, the fields where the rye grew, where the cattle grazed, where the accused were led in chains from their homes to the meeting house, and from the meeting house to the jail, and from the jail to the court, and from the court to the gallows. Those fields are dark and still, and the grass that grows there now knows nothing of what happened, and the soil that holds the roots of that grass holds also the faintest trace of footsteps, long since dissolved into the chemistry of the earth, and the rain that falls on those fields tonight falls on ground that has been washed clean 10,000 times over, and will be washed clean 10,000 times again, and the water runs into the streams, and the streams run to the rivers, and the rivers run to the sea, carrying with them whatever remains of that terrible year, diluting it, dispersing it, spreading it so thin across the vast indifferent ocean that it becomes nothing, less than nothing, a memory of a memory of a memory dissolving into salt water and silence. And the stars turn overhead, the same stars that the Puritans watched with such anxious attention, searching for signs and portents in their cold arrangement, the same stars that shone down on the scaffold at Proctor's Ledge on those terrible execution days, the same stars that Giles Corey might have seen in the moments between the placement of each new stone upon his chest, the same stars that shine tonight on a world that has learned some lessons from Salem and forgotten others, and will have to learn them all again, because that is what it means to be human, to forget and to remember, to fail and to try again, to build systems of justice that are imperfect, and to strive imperfectly to make them better, and to carry within us always, always, the capacity for both extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary grace. The night deepens, the air cools, the old houses creak and settle on their foundations the way old houses do, the wood contracting in the cold, the beams shifting imperceptibly, the sounds so familiar and so gentle that they become a kind of music, a lullaby played on the instrument of time itself. And if you were to stand in one of those old doorways and listen very carefully, you might hear beneath the creaking and the settling and the whisper of the wind in the bare branches something that sounds almost like breathing, the slow, steady breathing of a place that has carried its burden for so long that the burden has become part of its rhythm, part of its pulse, part of the deep and patient heartbeat of a landscape that has seen everything and survived everything and is still here. Still quiet, still waiting for the morning that always comes. Let your own breathing slow now to match that rhythm. Let the story settle into the place where stories go when they have been fully told, not forgotten but released, set down gently like a heavy book placed on a bedside table, the cover closed, the pages still, the words still there but no longer demanding your attention, no longer asking anything of you except that you let them rest. The candle that has been burning through this long telling is guttering now, the flame shrinking, the wax pooling, the light it casts growing smaller and softer and warmer, a circle of gold contracting on the table, on the wall, on the ceiling above, and soon it will go out. And that is all right, because the darkness that follows is not the darkness of Salem, not the darkness the Puritans feared, not the darkness of accusation and suspicion, and the terrible machinery of persecution, but the ordinary darkness of a night that is simply a night, safe and quiet and deep, a darkness made for sleeping, made for rest, made for the letting go of all the things the waking mind holds so tightly and so unnecessarily. The stones in the memorial are still tonight, the names still carved, the interrupted sentences still reaching for completions they will never find, And there is a kind of peace in that incompleteness, a recognition that some things cannot be resolved, some wounds cannot be fully healed, some stories cannot be given neat and satisfying endings, and that the acceptance of this incompleteness is itself a form of wisdom, a form of grace, a form of the deep and quiet understanding that comes only when you stop trying to make the world make sense and simply let it be what it is, broken and beautiful and endlessly human. The breathing slows, the thoughts loosen their grip and begin to drift, the way leaves drift on the surface of a slow-moving stream, turning lazily in the current, catching the light for a moment and then passing into shadow. And each thought that drifts away makes room for a deeper stillness, a quieter space, a softer darkness, and you are sinking now, sinking gently, the way the last light sinks below the horizon, the way the last sound sinks below the threshold of hearing, the way the old stones in the burying ground sink slowly, year by year, into the mossy earth that will eventually reclaim them entirely, and there is nothing to resist in this sinking, nothing to fear, only the gentle downward pull of rest, of sleep, of the body finally releasing the tension it has carried through the day and surrendering to the simple animal pleasure of being horizontal and warm and safe and still. The story is over. The voices have faded. The courtroom is empty, the scaffold dismantled, the jail cells opened, the chains removed, and what remains is only this, the quiet, the dark, the slow and steady rhythm of your breathing, each breath a little deeper than the last, each exhalation a little longer, a little softer, carrying you further and further from the waking world and closer to the place where dreams begin, that threshold between consciousness and sleep, where the mind lets go of its need to understand and simply drifts, simply floats, simply rests in the vast and gentle darkness that is not emptiness but fullness, not absence but presence, the presence of peace, the presence of quiet, the presence of a silence so complete and so kind that it feels like being held, like being rocked, like being carried gently down a long, slow river toward a sea that has no shore and no horizon, only depth, only stillness, only the endless, borderless, bottomless calm of